The ice kept its own counsel for tens of thousands of years, a white hush that smothered sound and swallowed time. That hush changed when a seam opened, not like a crack but like a remembered word returning to the lips after long silence. From that seam came a slow exhalation of warmth and light, a subtle rearrangement of the ice itself, and something that had been sleeping folded into the geometry of the earth began to turn its thoughts toward waking. The world above them felt the change as a tremor and a different kind of weather, and below, under this new light, monuments sighed awake in the sleep memories of a civilization unfurled. When the ice cracked open, the world started remembering. Subscribe and write in the comments what stirs you more, the mystery waking below or the change you can already feel above. For as long as people could remember, myths rode the winds from the high Arctic, stories of a people older than the sun's last circumnavigation, of a city that breathed in patterns like a living thing, of scholars who read the language of storms. Scholars argued over the myths. Fishermen laughed them off when they repaired nets under the low winter sun. But myths preserve what is true in disguise, and when the ice opened, those old stories began to register as literal reality again, a map revealing itself in slow, patient strokes. The city beneath the ice had never been wholly human in the way people understand that word. Its builders drew on a long lineage of experiment and empathy. They sculpted living rock and coaxed crystalline lattices to sing with currents. Their architecture grew in living rhythms, windows breathing salt and light, corridors that curved like whale song, meeting places where warmth was woven into the air itself. This was a civilization that had made habit of listening, to tides, to glaciers, to the slow tilt of epochs, and then shaping its life accordingly. You could call them Hyperboreans because that was what the northern maps had once called the lands beyond the known, but names are only labels for stories that require resonant sound. They called themselves by phrases that translated poorly into modern tongues, keepers of the deep light, the ones who remember beneath. Their language moved like thawing, quick to melt into metaphor, precise where it mattered, suffused with the grammar of weather and time. To hear a Hyperborean speaker argue was to watch a storm assemble and then clear into sky. To read their journals was to feel the ocean press itself to the back of your teeth. Their technology resembled magic to later observers because they had learned to blur the line between biological systems and engineered designs. They grew conduits from algae that conducted heat and thought, threaded storage in layers of ice that remembered chemical patterns for millennia, and built memory stones that recorded sound in fractal geometry. Machines in Hyperborean hands were more like gardens than factories. They tended processes, trimmed unwanted growth, coaxed beneficial mutations, and did not think in terms of extraction but of reciprocity. This reciprocity informed everything. When the Hyperboreans hunted, they sang permission into the northern seas. When they harvested light from the aurora, they gave back in slow bloomings of coral-like structures that fed fish and filtered water. Gardens of glass seaweed refracted color into the under-ice cathedrals and fed the bioluminescent life that compensated for the lack of sun. Even the stones were taught a kind of etiquette. They released stored energy only when the rhythms of the city required it, and only after a patient tally of need and consequence. Their social order was a weave rather than a ladder, each thread carrying a responsibility to the others. Elders who had stood watch through 3 ice cycles remembered old alignments of the stars. Young artisans reshaped those memories into new songs. Craft guilds were both practical and ceremonial, and the politics of mediation mattered more than the politics of will. Decisions were mediated in long nights of consensus, and the pulsing exchange of stories, and the calibrated sway of voices. Argument was an art that sharpened the community rather than dividing it. You can imagine the first human eyes that saw the re-emerging ramparts and terraces, goggles fogged, breath-catching in frost-white beards, cameras trained like compasses toward something that shouldn't be there. Expeditions came with flags and instruments, with notes full of wonder and hunger. Scientists recalibrated their models as ancient radiocarbon contests and seismic anomalies contradicted every tidy assumption. Indigenous elders, whose families had whispered of old pathways across the ice, watched closely and recognized the rhythm of certain songs carried by the wind, their knowledge threaded through the arrival like a familiar pattern. The awakening did not happen all at once. It began in parts, a tram of warm water that pulsed under an ancient avenue, a row of column-carved basalt that breathed steam into the ice ceiling, a ring of doors that opened outward into a thin corridor of light. Those who first entered felt time shift. Stone-carved glyphs hummed under their fingertips, as if the city itself were responding to touch. A smell, like cedar and charged rain, filled the air. Machines and living things turned their attention to the newcomers with the same curiosity a forest might show to a new spring. Inside the galleries, there were rooms of maps that had been carved on mother-of-pearl and set in living wood. These maps did not show only physical geography, they portrayed energy flows, trade routes of whales, seasonal migrations of light, and the histories of conversations between currents. A Hyperborean map was a chronicle and a function, a way to see both where you had been and where you might go. Explorers realized quickly that understanding these maps required listening, not just looking, and that listening demanded generous patience. The city's guardians had adapted to a slow world, but they were not passive. In anticipation of changes, they had woven contingency into their designs. When sea levels rose, terraces flexed on living pilings. When the aurora dimmed, mirror lattices refracted starlight into the civic centers. They were prepared for many eventualities, and yet they had not expected the particular speed of human-driven climate change. The rapidity of modern thaw disturbed patterns the Hyperboreans had assumed would unfold on other scales, forcing an acceleration in their plans and in their habit of trusting the future to slow processes. As the Hyperboreans stepped out of sleep, they looked at the surface world with a mixture of grief and resolve. They recognized the scarred maps of industrial ambition, oil-blackened ice, lines of exhaust that remembered themselves in the sky. But they also counted the small, stubborn sparks of habit. Not all fires were destructive. Communities had sprung up that still honored reciprocity, people who tended gardens of reclaimed land and practiced patient economies. The Hyperboreans could see where their own methods might help restore balance, and so their awakening included a decision: they would engage, but not without condition. Their first contact with modern humans was mediated through ritual rather than proclamation. A group of elders, wrapped in woven lightcloth, glided up to the edge of a research camp and offered the researchers water that tasted of deep storm. They did not speak the languages the scientists were trained for. Instead, they hummed a low frequency, a compression of chords that carried meaning as clearly as words. In translation sessions that followed, interpreters found that the Hyperboreans organized meaning around experience and consequence rather than abstract categories. They asked questions that sounded like weather. How does this action bend the river? What song did you teach your children about taking? Media, however, insisted on spectacle and simplified everything into headlines. Political leaders called it invaluable treasure or a threat to sovereignty, whichever fit their agendas that day. Activists called for restraint and for access. Corporations saw patents in promising new flows of energy. The Hyperboreans watched this theater of rapid decisions with an old patience and a quiet sorrow. They had endured cycles of exploitation before and recognized the patterns that led from curiosity to cleavage. It took months of translation, of patient sitting in the cold, and the exchange of small, careful gifts, for meaningful communication to take hold. Human linguists discovered that Hyperborean concepts of memory were not linear. They archived not only facts but tendencies and probable futures, stored as harmonics in crystalline matrices that responded to both sound and touch. When a human scientist placed a hand on a memory stone, images arrived as layered textures, the growth of a city as if it were a single living thing, the slow cycle of snowfall, the pulse of human laughter that had once echoed in its halls. These stones held witness to choices, and the Hyperboreans treated them like confessors. The records revealed how the Hyperboreans had once flown across the polar ocean on winged rafts of braided kelp, how they had held long councils under auroral storms, and how they had negotiated with migrating mammalkind as with kin. They told of an era when exchange between species was a given, when currents and creatures were partners in a vast, ongoing choreography. When modern listeners heard these histories, they felt both wonder and a pang of regret for what had been lost in later centuries of extraction and partition. Still, some felt possible hope. An ancient technique for living with extremes might be adapted to modern needs. But there were secrets in the stones that even the elders hesitated to name. Buried deep in a vault called the Lattice of Return was a record of a project the Hyperboreans called the Deep Keep. They had once taken the seeds of their own people and woven them into the ice in a long gambit against an unknown calamity. This was not simply a gene bank but an archive of behavioral patterns, memory songs, and living recipes for survival in altered climates. The Deep Keep was a deliberate hedge against forgetting, designed to store not only DNA but cultural contingencies that could be evoked when the time came. When the city opened, the Deep Keep's outer seals cracked like a sleeping eye opening. The first wave of material that emerged was not warlike nor grandiose. It consisted of gardens made of glass and snow, of carefully preserved chapters from Hyperborean literature, and of small, patient creatures adapted to the low-light under-ice world. The resumption of these living projects required tending. Hyperborean biotenders began to coax those gardens back to vigor. They taught humans the subtle arts of coaxing life without imposing will, a touch, a song, a delayed response that allowed organisms to find their own path. There were dangers, of course. The Deep Keep held things that modern bioethics had no language for, and some of the preserved organisms carried resilient traits that could outcompete local species if misapplied. Hyperborean elders insisted on time, and on stewardship, and that translators and lawyers and scientists sit together in common houses of listening before any living thing left the vault. They insisted on a covenant, no release without consent of those who would be affected, human or otherwise. For those steeped in quick commerce, this was frustration. For those who had learned from the Hyperboreans' long practice, it was a necessary restraint. One of the most striking aspects of the Hyperboreans was their relationship with light. They cultivated a form of bioluminescence that was as much culture as biology. Light there did not only illuminate, it annotated. A room might glow faintly to record a meeting, its intensity and color shifting to represent who was present and what promises were made. Galleries of remembrance glowed in soft hues that together told histories in a living illumination. To be inside such a place was to have the past not only shown to you but felt on the skin like warmth. Their energy systems balanced on the knife edge of beauty and function. They harvested thermal gradients from undersea vents with arrays of living spines, reels of kelp that conducted heat, and crystal harvesters that sang when they stored energy. Unlike crude storage tanks, these systems responded to the play of many small lives. They refused to spike power like the harsh flash of a nuclear plant. Instead, they practiced slow release, like a river running through drought. The Hyperboreans believed that energy, too, had ethics. You had to give it time to move, and you had to account for the animals and plants that used the same flows. When human engineers first peered at the blueprints that had been etched into basalt, they shook their heads at how elegant and mundane the solutions appeared. Here were systems that could stabilize microclimates in a way modern cities could emulate. Here were storage systems that never leaked and that repaired themselves with moss and coral. The temptation to patent, to privatize, and to scale was immediate and vast. A debate erupted that the Hyperboreans had predicted. Could these tools be shared without turning into weapons of domination? The question stung because it had no simple answer. The Hyperboreans, for their part, did not believe in the total sharing of knowledge without comprehension. They claimed that certain practices were safe only within particular social contexts, and that knowledge applied in one scenario could become catastrophic in another. So they practiced what might be called graduated disclosure, careful sharing of techniques paired with the teaching of ethics and the embedding of safeguards. That approach irritated many in the modern world who valued quick returns. Yet it yielded a different kind of trust, slow and tested, that made small but deep repairs in places where it mattered. In schools set into ice shelves, children of both kinds learned side by side. One day a student's hand would press against a memory stone and see the entire life cycle of a kelp forest in a wash of color, and another day they would learn to say the old songs that called whales by name. The pedagogy was a tapestry of practice and story, of doing and witnessing. It honored the fact that knowledge lives in the body as much as in the brain. Adults who came from modern universities grew impatient at the lack of quick metrics, while many teachers from traditional communities praised the patience woven into the classes. Culturally, the revival sparked an arts renaissance. New sculptures rose from fused ice and living crystal, each piece singing with internal harmonics. Poets stitched together old Hyperborean syntax with borrowed human metaphors, and the result was a hybrid language that could hold both the weight of time and the urgency of now. Musicians found ways to marry whale song with electronic modulation, producing compositions that shifted listeners' heartbeats into communal rhythms. The creative outpouring was not mere ornamentation. Art became the way the two worlds negotiated meaning without words. Yet the past had its shadows. Archaeologists found evidence of earlier wanderings, of policies that had once attempted to consolidate power by limiting access to certain knowledge. There were scandalous records of factions that had sought to weaponize climatic control long ago, and the Hyperborean elders told of a time when a schism nearly rent their society in two. They had healed, but the scars remained visible in certain rituals and the way elders taught caution. This made them both wise and guarded, a people who had forgiven and yet would not forget the cost of hubris. As the months stretched into seasons, new forms of governance emerged. Humans and Hyperboreans formed councils in the liminal spaces where ice met sea and where language tightened into agreement. These councils were not wholly democratic in the way many modern institutions imagine, neither were they oligarchies. They were hybrids built for ecological negotiation. Representatives had to demonstrate competence in the languages of both worlds, legal literacy for human systems, and the deeper, more tacit forms of fluency the Hyperboreans valued. The result was slow, messy, and oddly fitting to the new realities they faced. Out on the surface, geopolitics could not help but respond. Nations staked claims or proposed joint stewardship. Some militaries sent fleets, as if the Hyperboreans were a resource to be secured. Other nations, especially those of indigenous Arctic peoples, sought to assert pre-existing place-based rights. Diplomatic squabbles often felt small against the immensity of the shared task: how to restore balance to an ocean warming too quickly, to rejuvenate life in places once choked by heat and oil. The Hyperboreans taught those willing politicians a lesson that had guided their own policy for ages: before you legislate the world, you must learn how it speaks. There were moments of bitter conflict. A corporation attempted to drill beneath a declared sanctuary and encountered a backlash led by both Hyperboreans and local communities. The corporation's machines churned and then faltered when the earth itself seemed to refuse cooperation. Some machines rusted in strange patterns, gears growing thin with crystalline growth as if the ice itself were reclaiming what it had never belonged to them. These confrontations forced modern legal systems to reckon with questions that had not yet been codified. Should the ground have rights? Could non-human interests be represented within courts? Scientists continue to probe the deeper mysteries of the Hyperboreans, among them the nature of their longevity. It became clear that their concept of aging differed from ours. Hyperboreans experienced time as concentric patterns, with life stages not marked by decline but by shifts of role and emphasis. Biological longevity came from regenerative practices built into diet and ritual, from circadian systems aligned to slow light, and from a cultural refusal of waste. They did not pursue immortality as a goal but balanced long lives with communal rotation, ensuring that power did not calcify into endless rule. One particularly delicate revelation involved the neural practice called the weave, an intersubjective mode of sharing sensation. The weave was not mind reading in the intrusive sense. Rather, it was a practiced discipline of empathy measured in harmonic concordances, a way of offering feeling without annihilating difference. You could join a weave to learn a skill or remember a place and then leave, your sense of self intact but expanded. The technique required centuries of social practice and a culture of consent so deep that the very notion of privacy had a different texture to it. Misusing the weave had been the source of one of their greatest ancient troubles, and they guarded it accordingly. Yet there was technological ingenuity that could be useful on a global scale. The Hyperboreans had developed methods for cooling urban heat islands by coaxing reflective microbial films to settle on roofs and streets, seeding thin strands of kelp engineered to lock carbon in fugitive forms, and redesigning runoff systems so that water filtered through a living sponge instead of being channeled into concrete drains. None of these techniques were quick fixes, but together they formed a set of practices that might restore local climates if deployed with reverence. The difficulty lay in scale, how to let these slow, local repairs have the sort of macroscopic effect necessary to alter planetary trajectories. Economics shifted. New markets sprang up for stewardship rather than extraction. People who once sought riches in raw materials now found flourishing where they invested in time-intensive restoration projects. Hyperborean artisans trained a new class of technicians in ways that honored both lineage and invention. In a world oriented toward speed and growth, this created friction but also inspiration. Some cities adopted living tariffs, taxes paid in seeds and time, and social capital became as valuable a currency as measurable money in certain circles. Religion and spirituality, which had always been intertwined with Hyperborean life, opened new conversations with the world's faiths. Shared rituals were co-created where prayers acknowledged both the divine and the material. People bowed before the sea and sang to the lights, offering thanks that were practical as well as devotional. Some religious groups feared syncretism, while others welcomed the added depth. The dialogues enriched both sides and occasionally produced tensions when cosmologies clashed, but overall, a rich pluralism began to take shape. Amid all of this, children played. They were the most untroubled about the future if you watched them closely. They learned new games that involved guiding light through crystals, or teaching small animals complex migration games, and they did so without the encumbrance of fear that gripped many adults. Children invented hybrid sports that made use of both Hyperborean gravitation practices and human technology. Watching them reminded elders why they had preserved the deep keep in the first place, for the possibility of futures that could not be imagined from the older vantage alone. Not everyone could make peace with the shift. Some communities felt erased by the change, their lifeways undermined by new regulations that, while intended to protect, also remade landscapes. Others felt empowered, newly visible after centuries of marginalization by global powers. The Hyperborean presence acted as a catalyst that revealed buried injustices and demanded new forms of redress. The process was messy and human. Healing required more than laws and treaties. It required time for new habits to be absorbed and old wounds to be tended. The natural world responded in ways that were sometimes encouraging. Species once thought on the brink of local extinction returned to areas where warming had earlier rendered them scarce, carried by restored currents and cooled microclimates. The sea's chemistry shifted in incremental ways that could be seen in the return of plankton blooms at times no one expected. Yet these rebounds were not guaranteed, and they came with their own surprises: new predator-prey dynamics, shifts in migration, and ecological competitions that had to be managed through careful stewardship rather than brute force. The Hyperboreans themselves grew in nuance as they learned to live with human unpredictability. They had once expected a certain rationality to the rest of the world, a pattern that did not always hold. Humans acted out of fear, of greed, of a half-formed desire to fix everything immediately. The Hyperboreans had to relearn patience for a different kind of impatience. They also learned to rely on human adaptability and kindness in unexpected ways, and these small human virtues became their strongest allies in the slow work of repair. One moment stood out as a turning point, a storm season when a shelf of ice threatened to break off and take with it a nursery of newly released coral-like structures. Hyperboreans and human volunteers worked together through the night, singing to the structures as they anchored them with living tendrils and guided currents with temporary channels. The work was arduous and required improvisation that neither culture had anticipated. When the danger passed, people from different backgrounds sat together under a sky washed in aurora, exhausted and laughing and aware that they had learned a new kind of trust. That event became emblematic. It was the sort of scene that documentary filmmakers loved: the dramatic tension, the glowing lights, the multinational crews working side by side. But its deeper significance lay in the way it changed the conversation about responsibility. Humans began to see that their actions could be both the source of ruin and the vehicle of restoration. The Hyperboreans had always known this balance. It is a lesson they had taught their young for millennia. Power without care is a recipe for ruin, and even small acts of care compound. A risk that people underestimated was the cultural weight that came with sharing the Hyperboreans' arts and rituals. Cultural appropriation became a thorny issue. Performances of certain songs, taken out of context and stripped of their covenant meanings, felt to elder Hyperboreans like theft. Humans who had once romanticized the Hyperboreans now had to learn humility about representation and about who could rightly participate in certain rites. The correction was not always gentle, but it led to a more conscientious artistic ethic in many circles. Meanwhile, scientists kept pressing further behind the city's bones, and they made a discovery so profound it altered basic assumptions about planetary cycles. In a chamber far below the central piazza, they found a crystalline chronometer that recorded not only climate but a pattern of pulses tied to a comet's slow passing every 30,000 years. The chronometer's readings hinted at periodicities in Earth's environment linked to larger cosmic rhythms. To humans inclined to think of climate as only a terrestrial, industrial problem, this was humbling news. It meant that human influence met a background of deeper cycles, which complicated interventions and made the case for humility even stronger. There was a philosophical debate that arose from this: if Earth is embedded in cosmic rhythms, what is the role of agency? For the Hyperboreans, the answer was simple because their culture already assumed a humbler role. They believed agency was meaningful but always contextualized by limits. For humans, steeped in a modern myth of mastery, the notion of limits required a painful recalibration. This led to new schools of thought, not reactionary but reflective, advocating for a partnership model rather than one of dominion. Some Hyperboreans held a view that bordered on the mystical, that their civilization had been seeded by travelers from a different world, or perhaps visitors of a different nature, who had shown them how to listen. They treated this story like a parable. It was less about literal aliens and more about the realization that knowledge often arrives from unexpected sources and that humility in reception is an ethical practice. Scientists rolled their eyes at mythic recasting, but the myths worked like lenses, making certain truths sharper rather than conflicting with evidence. The result was a cultural map that could hold myth and empiricism at once. As the years wore on, the two societies produced hybrid institutions. Universities at the fringe of the thawing zone taught curricula that combined Hyperborean memory work with human scientific rigor. Funding models shifted away from singular profit toward community steward endowments. Students who graduated from these programs became the cultural mediators of the new era, adept at negotiating both legal frameworks and the subtle language of living systems. They formed the backbone of a new generation committed to building resilient communities. The economy grew quieter in some ways and more artisanal in others. Massive extraction booms gave way to industries built around repair, cultivation, and rewilding. Craftspeople trained in Hyperborean techniques could mend fabrics with living stitches, and artisans made tiles that cleansed water through embedded moss. These goods were not cheap to produce, but they carried a deeper quality that made their scarcity tolerable. Consumers learned to value longevity and maintenance over constant replacement, a cultural shift that would take generations to cement. Not all were convinced. Some elites tried to capitalize on the Hyperboreans' techniques without permission, smuggling seeds and trying to train machines in the art of reciprocity. The results were uneven and sometimes catastrophic. When the social context was absent, the technologies bent toward exploitation. Failed experiments sometimes unleashed invasive strains or caused unintended shifts in local ecosystems. These incidents strengthened calls for international oversight and for licensing frameworks that respected the granular ethics demanded by these living systems. At the same time, indigenous communities that had long lived at the edges of the Hyperboreans' territory emerged as essential partners, bringing knowledge that had been undervalued by Western science. Their elders taught the Hyperboreans things about deep snow layering and the bearing of wind that refined the city's capacity to cohabit. Reciprocal learning blossomed, and for once it wasn't a one-way transmission of knowledge. The collaborative work reshaped narratives about who knew what and whose knowledge counted in global conversations. A human artist in one of the collaborative studios asked a Hyperborean elder why they had buried the deep keep at all if hiding knowledge could be dangerous. The elder replied with a counter-question about seasons. When a seed sleeps, it does so until conditions are right to sprout without being choked. The metaphor was gentle but precise. Some knowledge needed a gate. The gate had been created not to hoard but to protect. This answer did not satisfy everyone, but it shaped a nuanced principle that undergirded their approach to dissemination. Longer-term projects began to appear. A global effort to restore oceanic currents took shape, stitched from localized initiatives coordinated through the Council network. Hyperborean techniques provided new tools for steering currents without heavy-handed engineering. They proposed a decentralized choreography in which local communities were empowered to gently guide flows at key nodes, and the cumulative result could shift broader patterns. The plan was bold and full of unknowns, but it was predicated on the simple belief that many small, well-made repairs could accumulate into global change. Art and ritual again guided those repairs. Before a major current intervention, communities gathered to sing to the channel, to make offerings that were both symbolic and material. See roses planted to anchor sediments, biofilm seeded to stabilize temperature. The rituals had the pragmatic function of aligning intent and activating the local knowledge required to succeed. People found meaning in these ceremonies, and, crucially, the ceremonies created accountability. Breaking a promise in a ritual had social consequences that were as real as legal penalties. Science and art created a strange synthesis where data visualizations were turned into immersive performances and policy debates were reframed as public plays. Citizens engaged not only with abstract models but with embodied experiences that made policy comprehensible. A particularly influential performance recreated the story of a once-frozen bay over a generation, showing the audience how small choices made in one year rippled into dramatic ecological outcomes decades later. People left those performances less confident in instantaneous fixes and more inclined to incremental stewardship. There were moments of heartbreak. A southern community that had adopted Hyperborean cooling techniques found their own resources diverted by distant crises, and conservation projects were underfunded. Leaders wrestled with triage decisions about where to invest limited social capital. The ethical complexities of triage, the painful act of deciding which habitats or human communities to prioritize, became a heavy, public conversation. The Hyperboreans counseled patience and a framework for long-term resilience that tried to avoid quick triage decisions by building redundancy and networked support, but the moral dilemmas remained. Meanwhile, the Hyperboreans continued their own internal evolutions. New generations had hybrid identities, their skin patterned with faint bioluminescent traces from childhood rites, their minds steeped in both old songs and new data. They argued about how much of their traditions to share and which practices to reseal for future generations. Some young Hyperboreans wanted to travel farther into the human world, to spread their art and ethics like seeds. Others wanted to deepen the discipline of containment, fearing that too much exposure would dilute their fragile social practices. The satisfying aspect of this epic was the proliferation of small stories that told of change in human scale. An old fisherman taught a Hyperborean child how to mend a net, and the child taught the fisherman a lullaby that calmed fish into safer spawning banks. A municipal planner learned the art of living roofs and returned a city neighborhood into bloom. An artist discovered a new medium by combining kelp resin with glass lattice, creating panels that filtered sunlight into usable nutrients for rooftop gardens. These minor miracles multiplied and composed an aggregate rhythm of repair. In contrast, there were large-scale problems that resisted easy solutions. Soot and particulate pollution from faraway industrial zones continued to strain northern systems. Ocean acidification advanced in some regions despite localized restorations. The story of the Hyperboreans had no miraculous elixir for such distributed problems, and their presence alone could not compensate for decades of global neglect. What it did provide was tools of living repair and a moral framework that made the hard work of planetary-scale cooperation more thinkable. It gave people language and procedures to imagine a longer, slower recovery. Time had a different feeling in the Hyperborean towns that integrated with human settlements. Streets hummed with low rhythms that matched the living architecture, a background throb of communal breathing. Residents moved in a cadence that was not sluggish but deliberate, and this slowed tempo had consequences: fewer accidents, more attentive conversations, more time spent in repair. Some people worried that slower cities would be less productive, but productivity redefined itself in terms of longevity, not speed. Businesses learned to build for persistence, and the market rewarded those who could maintain quality across decades. A new academic field emerged called reciprocity studies, which combined ecological metrics with cultural analysis. Its practitioners studied how mutual obligations between species and between communities could be measured and nurtured. The field produced subtle metrics that governments used to evaluate policy, not only GDP and emissions but relational indices that tracked the health of interspecies partnerships. These metrics changed where funds flowed and what projects were prioritized. They did not solve everything, but they gave policy a different compass. In private moments, Hyperborean elders sometimes confessed fear. They had woken their civilization in a time of enormous human tumult. The weapons of rapid extraction and the seductions of profit could erode their practices. They feared the thin line between influence and domination. But their fear was held alongside hope, a belief that long cultural memory and the slow work of rebuilding could outlast greed if given allies in time. They looked at the children playing and allowed some small laughter to break their solemnity. The story of their awakening became a new chapter in the human understanding of stewardship. People who had once been taught to think of nature as resource were learning to think of it as partner. This shift did not happen uniformly, and it would take generations to be fully realized. But even those who resisted found the siren call of quick profit more dissonant when confronted with living systems that refused to cooperate when abused. Policies hardened only slowly, but culture bent toward the new ethic. One of the most delicate projects was the rewilding of a river delta that had been channelized for decades. The Hyperboreans taught local engineers how to reintroduce meanders by planting living anchors that coaxed currents into new paths. The work took years and required a patient choreography of planting and retreating. When the delta finally reasserted more natural flows, communities downstream found renewed abundance, fisheries improved, and flood cycles moderated. The rewilding offered proof that patient interventions could repair accumulated harms, though it also showed the moral costs of neglect and the complicated labor required to reverse damage. The Hyperboreans themselves learned the art of tactical compromise. They accepted that certain technologies might be used imperfectly for a time in order to build trust and partnerships. For example, they allowed a hybrid power node to be constructed by human engineers under Hyperborean oversight, knowing it might not match their ideal but could reduce fossil fuel dependence on the margin. The project cost time and political capital but gradually proved its worth. It stabilized an entire community's energy needs while providing a physical example of what ethical engineering could look like. There were darker moments in which human greed tried to weaponize aspects of the Hyperboreans' knowledge. Saboteurs attempted to steal weave practices and commercialize them in manipulative ways. The resulting harms were terrible and immediate. People manipulated emotionally and policy decisions became volatile. In response, the Hyperboreans convened a council that included philosophers, ethicists, and ordinary citizens. They drafted a covenant, a binding set of principles for the use of intersubjective technologies. It did not eliminate abuse, but it created binding norms and accountability mechanisms that made future misuse more costly. The covenant itself became a model for international law, a template for how a non-human stakeholder could be represented in human governance. Its language did not merely assign rights to snow or stone, it articulated obligations of care and processes for consent. Nations adapted its structure to create living charters for habitats and ecosystems. The legal innovations were creative and messy, as law usually is when it steps into new territory, but they set precedents that changed how courts adjudicated environmental harms. As decades flowed, the world changed subtly in visible ways. Coastlines rebuilt their fringing life, cities began to incorporate living facades that cooled neighborhoods, and food systems localized around resilient methods that drew from Hyperborean gardening techniques. The change was not universal and it was not linear. Crises continued. The transition was not a story of perfect redemption but of messy attempt and variable success. That was, in many ways, the point. The Hyperboreans had never promised salvation. They offered methods for living and a moral frame, and it was up to human societies to decide how to adopt them. Museums curated the story of the awakening, and the exhibits tried to avoid martyrizing the Hyperboreans as a lost golden age. Curators emphasized their peoplehood, with flaws and virtues, and the story of their recovery and generosity. Exhibits included the living memory stones, interactive installations that required visitors to practice 2 minutes of silence before engaging, instilling a ritual of slowing and focus. The museums became places where the public learned to practice listening in a structured way, and those rituals had ripple effects in the wider culture. One generational turning point arrived when a Hyperborean who had spent months living among surface communities ran for a joint council position and won. Their platform was less about grand gestures and more about durable institutions, seed banks managed by local communities, legal pathways for ecosystems to have representatives, and education reforms that taught reciprocity from early childhood. Their election signified not a conquest but the maturation of the hybrid political systems. It showed that institutions could incorporate the wisdom of long-lived cultures without erasing their difference. A generation learned that real power comes from working together, not taking over. Subscribe and write in the comments what inspires you more, the courage to change the system or the patience to make it better. The Hyperboreans never sought to dominate the planet's recovery, but neither did they remain confined to their reclaimed city. They accepted invitations to consult in temperate coastal towns, and mountain valleys, and even in deserts where microclimates could be coaxed into bearing life. Their methods were not universal cures, they required adaptation to context and local knowledge. The collaboration reinforced a central lesson: solutions are not technical alone but social. A technique without the social frame to practice it ethically is a tool for ruin. At times the narrative became mythic, spun into grand stories about ancient wisdom versus modern hubris. The media loved such binaries. In truth, the story of the waking Hyperboreans resisted neat divides. They were not saints nor villains. They were a civilization anchored in reciprocity and patient practice, whose awakening ignited both hope and complications in a planet already at risk. The truth was textured, made of small acts and big mistakes, of hard-won compromises and stubbornly repeated rituals. As the century turned, climate indicators nudged toward stability in pockets where investments in patient care had been made. Atmospheric carbon curves flattened only slowly, but trends were not as dirge-like as they had once been. Economic models adapted, showing how investments in living infrastructure could save trillions over a lifetime compared with extractive approaches. The presence of the Hyperboreans did not create miracles, but it changed the arithmetic in favor of maintenance and repair rather than consumption and disposal. Cultural exchange continued to deepen. Some Hyperboreans learned to code and to work on human-designed networks, teaching computers a way to respect local ecological envelopes. Some humans learned weave practices and adapted them into therapeutic settings, always under covenant and oversight. The ongoing experiments in intercultural fusion were messy and often costly, but they bore fruit in unexpected innovations and in everyday interactions that made life more cooperative. The deepest secret beneath the ice remained the same, that survival, for any intelligent species, requires humility and a willingness to change habits. The Hyperboreans had known this for ages. Their brilliance lay in their patient institutionalization of that knowledge. They had baked caution into rituals, turned repair into art, and taught young generations to measure success over decades rather than headlines. Their awakening taught humanity that certain answers are slow building and that impatience is often a prelude to harm. Toward the horizon, new projects unfolded, from seeded reefs to restored tundra mosaics. People who had come to the north as seekers of spectacle stayed as stewards, and communities grew around shared responsibilities. Where conflict once arose, governance structures learned to embed living feedback loops, councils that included non-human proxies, rituals of consent that carried legal weight, and educational programs that taught the art of listening. This did not make the world safe overnight, but it supplied a framework in which safety could be slowly rebuilt. Old stories reemerged and were reframed. The Hyperborean myths that once seemed fanciful were retold with new evidence, and they became a kind of moral scaffolding for a new age. The tale of the people who slept beneath the ice became not a legend of isolation but a parable about the dangers of forgetting and the potency of patient wisdom. Its lessons were taught in classrooms and in kitchens and on ships. They became part of a broader ethic that people carried like a small, necessary burden. In the long arc, the awakening was less an event than a long relationship, an extended negotiation between species and cultures, an experiment in shared responsibility. The city beneath the ice did not conquer the modern world, nor did it become consumed by it. Instead, it and the world beyond it entered into a new grammar of mutual shaping. People learned to ask different questions, not how can we use this to dominate, but who will be affected, and how will we care for them before and after we act? To stand at the border where the old ice met the thaw was to feel a profound modesty. The wind carried salt and the cold tasted like history. The Hyperboreans stepped forward into a world that was noisy and impatient and vulnerable. They carried with them ancient stone songs and living gardens, ethics and experiments, a willingness to teach and also a fierce will to protect their practices. If the story had a moral, it was that the deep work of repair requires both memory and daring, memory to know what matters and daring to stay with the slow, awkward work of rebuilding a world that still had time to heal. They taught us rhythms that matched the Earth's propensity to mend if given a chance. We, in turn, showed them the chaotic generosity of human improvisation and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat that sometimes yields surprising innovations. The relationship that formed was not tidy but alive, and it kept changing as new challenges arrived. Perhaps the final hope of this story is modest, that two very different ways of being in the world can learn to share, to correct the excesses of each other, and together hold the line long enough for future generations to inherit a planet that is not only survivable but also worth living in. And so the ice kept speaking, and the world learned to listen. The Hyperboreans never demanded acclaim, they wanted only that the rhythms they had protected for millennia be allowed to continue, adapted with care. They taught children to hold small seeds in their palms and to promise to return them to the earth with a song. They taught leaders how to legislate with patience. They taught artists how to make light into law. In the quiet moments between storms, under a sky that held the aurora like a lid of green, people sat and listened to the slow, necessary chant of repair. No single ending closes this tale, because awakenings seldom end, they continue in the work of living. The city beneath the ice remains a place of study and solace, its gates opening now and then to those who have learned how to enter with adequate humility. In villages up and down the northern coast, the pattern of reciprocity takes root in small ways, in gardens, in laws, in songs taught to infants. Each such act is a small correction, and together, over time, they reshape the world in ways that cannot be measured in a single lifetime. Listen as you drive and as you walk, for the story is not only in the monuments but in the habits that follow. The Hyperborean awakening is a reminder that secrets can be awoken not only by discovery but by our willingness to change. Beneath the ice lies not only a civilization but a mode of relationship we have little practiced, patient stewardship. If we hear that lesson, carry it like a slow warmth, and act accordingly, perhaps the wakefulness of one ancient people will ripple into a lasting habit for many more. Imagine, if you will, a world wrapped in ceaseless white, where the wind speaks in a language older than maps and the horizon is a thin, silver promise. In that vastness there rose a people whose name barely survives in rumor and bone, an advanced civilization we now call Hyperborean. They did not merely endure the cold, they embraced it, shaped it, and learned to read the patterns of frost and storm as if those patterns were letters in a living book. The story I will tell folds time and myth together, and asks you to listen as if you might catch a phrase of an old chant on the wind. When the first light of this tale arrives, it comes on a cold breath, subtle and precise, moving like a hand that knows the knotted threads hidden beneath a rug. The Hyperboreans learned to measure things that others dismissed as chaos: the slow drift of ice, the way certain crevices held whispers, the manner in which light bent across low clouds. They called themselves by words that meant many things at once: builders, watchers, keepers of patterns, and they built not just for shelter but to remember. Stones and beams, polished ice and bronze, were each set in a sequence meant to hold ideas as much as weight. Think of the Arctic as a vast library and the Hyperboreans as librarians who read by candlelight and aurora. Their libraries were not only rooms with shelves, they were amphitheaters of wind and sound, halls hollowed into permafrost that transformed blizzards into scores of music. A door would groan like an instrument, and when it shut, the inside retained a memory of the outside temperature and sound like a pressed flower retains its color. That quality, this ability to let place remember, became central to their technology and their philosophy, for in a land where everything moves slowly, memory is both tool and currency. You must picture the Guardians now, the Arctic Titans, not as solitary colossi but as a living order of people whose roles blended warrior, scholar, and priest. They were chosen for physical endurance but also for a temperament that could sit with long truths. When a Titan stood watch atop a crystalline spire, they were not simply scanning for danger, they were listening for the cadence of the sea ice and reading the slow script of the sky. Their training included nights of silence where the only sound was the breathing of the world, and in those nights they learned to distinguish between a crack that foretold rupture and a song that foretold migration. This civilization rose on several pillars, practical and metaphysical. The first pillar was an intimate science of ice and geology, a set of crafts that allowed them to carve living spaces into the landscape without angering it. The second pillar was an oral technology, a way of encoding knowledge in rhythm and melody that might survive the ravages of time and temperature. The third pillar, and perhaps the most tender, was an ethic of stewardship. They believed knowledge should be wielded to protect the place that held them. To them, genius was not the quick seizure of secrets but the careful tending of a flame so it might last for centuries. The architecture of the Hyperboreans looked, at first glance, like a contradiction. It was both fortress and garden, austere and baroque. Towers rose like stalagmites frozen upward, their faces dotted with polished windows that refracted auroral light into soft mosaics. Each window, each lattice, each passage was oriented to capture a specific phenomenon: tides of cold, the path of migrating lights, the shadow of a long-vanished peak. And these orientations formed a network of signposts that could be read by those who knew their language. When you walked through such a place, you moved through memory as much as space, each doorway a chapter and every corridor a stanza. The Hyperboreans cultivated materials that in our world appear humble and ordinary, but in their hands were carriers of wonder. They treated ice as a medium rather than an obstacle, mixed with metallic filaments and stone to make a composite that was both flexible and resonant. They learned to anneal crystal with sound, feeding notes into chilled chambers so the formations would settle in harmonic alignments rather than brittle lattices. That practice produced living tools, sundials that remembered the slow wobble of stellar motion, mirrors that kept subtle records of the polar night. To their eyes, a shard of ice could be a map, and a polished lens could be a diary. Language among the Hyperboreans flowed like water and drifted like smoke. They used compound words that folded multiple meanings into a single utterance, so a phrase that might translate as watchtide could equally mean careful knowledge or promise-keeping. This compression of meaning was essential in a climate where sound could travel far and the wrong word could travel even further. Poems were not mere art, they were legal texts and navigational codes, and songs could summon aid from miles away because the rhythms carried in the cold air like smoke. Their poets were not decorative but necessary, each verse a woven rope that connected people and place. Central to their spiritual life was a belief in the reciprocity between human thought and the frozen environment. They did not presume dominion, instead they practiced a continuous exchange with the land. Offerings were not only of meat or craft but of attention, hours devoted to listening, to repairing fissures, to settling a rock back into its place after it had been displaced by ice. The Titans were taught to treat every scar in the world as a call for healing, and the way they healed was often inventive, introducing particular frequencies of sound to knit ice, or seeding boreholes with warm, mineral-rich water to coax new patterns into stability. The guardianship itself had procedural rigors that read like ritual and like engineering at once. A Titan would spend seasons bonded to a station where they learned to map a swath of horizon in precise increments, counting the beats in a gull's cry, measuring the interval between auroral pulses, logging the minute shifts in an ice shelf. They kept ledgers, but these were not paper as we understand it. They were arrays of notches and tones, stones warmed to a certain hue, even knots in rope whose spacing and tension encoded weather history. When a new sentinel took over a post, there was a formal transfer, a sensing of the place that required the predecessor to sing the register of its memory aloud while the newcomer listened and repeated. Relationships between Hyperborean communities were mediated by these memory transfers, and that created a network of interdependence across a landscape that seemed, to outsiders, unbearably isolated. Caravans crossed frozen expanses not just to trade pelts or metals, but to exchange cache queries of knowledge, each package sealed with a tune that unlocked its content. Disputes were often adjudicated by appealing to these recordings. If two villages argued over the origin of a river bend, they might call a Titan who had once logged the spot and ask them to play it back in tone and not. It was a system that privileged shared witness over solitary claim. Over time, the Hyperboreans' knowledge accrued into certain great repositories, underground complexes where the very foundation of the earth was carved into rooms and colonnades. These repositories were both practical and sacred. They housed instruments calibrated to the slowest motions of the planet and artifacts of cultural memory. Some chambers were filled with layered ice sheets that, when thawed, released a chorus of trapped air-bearing scents and microscopic particulates that told of summers long past. Other rooms contained stones polished to acoustic perfection, each stone attuned to a specific kind of truth, a legal judgment, a medical formula, a recipe for building resilient hulls. Into these vaults the Arctic Titans were entrusted with a particular subset of the civilization's knowledge, the techniques of listening, the protocols of rescue, and a catalog of predictive signs. Given the precariousness of their environment, the Titans could not hoard advantage. Their duty required them to instruct neighboring communities whenever necessary. That labor created a culture of seasonal pilgrimages where trainees would gather and spend a cycle learning the choreography of rescue, how to use reflected light to signal under a whiteout, how to stitch together ice ladders from flexible schist, and how to calm panicked caravans through coordinated song. The art of rescue became indistinguishable from the art of teaching. One of their most cherished instruments was a suite of carved amber lenses called the record mirrors, which captured the interplay of light across days and archived it as a pattern so subtle only a practiced eye could read. These mirrors did not store images in the sense of paint and palette. They held impressions, modes of movement and pulse that suggested climatic tendencies. A Titan could hold a mirror up and say, with near certainty, that a particular ridge would calve in a certain season. That knowledge informed migration schedules and the placement of settlements, and it was treated with a solemnity akin to religious prophecy. Yet the Hyperboreans were not fatalists. Their lore balanced prediction with intervention. When a mirror indicated an impending calamity, the community convened to alter the conditions if possible, planting windbreaks of piled stone to slow ice, redirecting meltwater through channels to relieve pressure, or, when all else failed, creating safe corridors for migration. Their engineering was improvisational and elegant. They learned how to use heat to shift pressure points without causing collapse, and how to pattern a row of reflective surfaces to change the sun's local behavior across critical hours. These interventions were never simple, and they involved long nights of argument and experimentation that the culture revered as moral laboratory. Story and song played a crucial role in such experiments because narrative is the scaffolding of communal imagination. The Hyperboreans told parables about storms as if they were actors with motives, and those stories allowed them to plan by anthropomorphizing weather and landscape. A tale about a cheeky wind that loved to steal a child's cap could mask a technical instruction about securing lines, and a myth of a sea giant pulling at the ice could encode safe paths over thin surfaces. This blending of myth and manual was not deception but pedagogy adapted to the unique needs of a society where memory had to be portable and resilient. Their calendar was as much auditory as it was numeric, structured around a cycle of chants that marked seasons, storms, and long-term cycles of drift. These chants functioned as timestamps. By hearing a particular refrain, a listener could place an event within a temporal lattice stretching back generations. Each chant carried modifications from previous episodes, an addition here for a harsh winter, a softening there after a careful experiment, so the calendar itself was a living text, corrected and annotated through communal practice rather than idle revision. The effect was to make time feel like a shared project, a sequence everyone had a hand in shaping. Material culture among the Hyperboreans reflected their dual commitments to durability and resonance. Tools were seldom single-purpose. A blade might double as a tuning bar, and a sledge runners could be used as a calibration plane for measuring subtle slope. In a single object there might be layers of utility, an insulating weave that doubled as musical cording, or a stone that served as both anchor and memory stone. They praised efficiency, but more than that they praised adaptability. Objects were designed to be repurposed and taught to a new use as circumstance changed. That philosophy kept their material world spare but rich with meaning. Their craftspeople were mythic figures in the social imagination, the forgers of devices that could translate the environment into human-readable sign. Blacksmiths who worked with frozen alloys were part metallurgist, part acoustician, and part poet, for the tempering of metal required exact sound as much as precise heat. They could coax a piece into a pitch that resonated with sea ice, and by listening to the way that pitch changed they could deduce stress points in the ice far beyond the eye's reach. Such talents were guarded in apprenticeships that lasted decades, because the techniques relied on subtle embodied knowledge transmitted slowly and with ceremony. Money, as we know it, meant little to them. Their economy was measured in mutual credit, in ledger songs, and in the obligation of aid. A favor sung in proper cadence had a value that could be called upon across generations. In times of scarcity, the vaults opened not to a market but to a council of need, and the Arctic Titans mediated those exchanges because they were trained to see the long-term consequences of distribution. The ethics of this system are complicated. Favor can create debt and obligation can become coercion, but in a harsh world where survival often required swift reciprocity, such mechanisms were adaptive and imbued with moral weight. There is a particular temper of loneliness that shapes life in the far north, and the Hyperboreans responded to it with rituals of kinship that extended the family into the landscape itself. Parents named babies after a particular ridge or wind so that the child's identity would always be tethered to a place, and elders were routinely called bones of certain valleys because their memory was considered the structural support of the community. Houses bore names and songs older than the people living within them, and those names transformed the built environment into a network of relations. Thus every structure was a person and every person had a place. This animistic tilt meant that harm to the land was personal injury, a breach in the social fabric. When a glacier retreated, it was mourned in public ceremony as one would mourn the death of a leader. In those mourning rituals there were songs that attempted to coax the ice back, not out of magical delusion but as a way of reimagining the relationship and preparing collective strategies. Grief, in this sense, was a practical instrument for planning. It concentrated attention and mobilized labor in ways that bureaucratic memos never could. The Hyperboreans had a complex relationship with technology and secrecy. There were innovations they guarded fiercely, certain techniques kept within Titan houses and passed down in whispers. At the same time, the core of their survival depended on sharing knowledge widely, so guarded secrets were more often ceremonial protocols than crucial tools. They recognized that hoarding too much advantage risked creating brittle dependencies. A community that could not teach itself to repair would atrophy under long winters and unexpected calvings. The balance between guardedness and openness was a constant ethical negotiation. Among the most enigmatic of their preserved practices was the ritual of the deep listening, an extended vigil during which Titans would enter an ice cavern and attune themselves to the slow, subterranean noises of the planet. The vigil lasted days on end, with only small periods of rest and intermittent offerings of light. The experience was both physical and metaphoric. Participants reported feeling as though the Earth had a pulse, a low frequency they could align with and, in aligning, glean insights into seismic events or tidal echoes. The data collected through these vigils was never coldly parsed. It was read in conjunction with songs and stories so that predictions carried emotional intelligence as well as technical accuracy. If you imagine these vigils as laboratory sessions, imagine too that the variables were not just physical but social. The deep listening was as much about sensing communal mood as it was about geological rumblings. A village under stress would add certain dissonances to the acoustic field that the Titans learned to interpret. That ability to read group psyche in acoustic terms made them effective mediators of conflict and helped the civilization manage the slow pressures of scarcity and paranoia. Their governance was therefore decentralized in practice, but harmonized by these shared methods of sensing. The Hyperboreans did not live separated from other cultures. They traded, fought, and intermarried with neighboring peoples. These interactions were rarely simple. Foreigners arrived with different logics, some obsessed with speed, some with accumulation, and the Titans often found themselves negotiating the friction between a fast world and a slow one. There were moments of deep cooperation where techniques spread and became hybridized. A southern smith might learn ice annealing, while a Hyperborean singer might adopt a new melodic mode. There were also times of exploitation when outside forces sought to extract knowledge without reciprocating stewardship, and those moments tested the moral courage of the Titans. As centuries wore on, pressures greater than any single storm began to press against the Hyperboreans' way of life. Changing climatic patterns altered migratory paths and introduced new stresses on ice shelves that the old models did not fully anticipate. Their predictive instruments, brilliant as they were in context, found themselves needing constant recalibration to account for emergent variables. This is not the tale of a sudden collapse, but rather a complex of strains that slowly eroded some of the civilization's structural certainties and forced hard decisions about relocation and preservation. In response, the Titans became more deliberate about legacy. Recognizing that they might not hold all knowledge forever, they instituted a practice of distributed repositories, creating low-profile caches across the Arctic that contained critical tunes, tools, and treaties. These caches were designed to be found by those who needed them, but to avoid theft by opportunists. They required knowledge of certain chants or a precise tuning to unlock. The caches also functioned as political statements. They asserted a claim to time beyond the present and invited future communities to inherit a similar ethic of care. Embedded in their moral philosophy was a narrative about cycles and stewardship that anticipates the modern idea of sustainability. They did not simply manage resources for the next year or even the next generation. They attempted to hold trajectories in ways that preserved the possibility of future flourishing. This meant conservative harvesting, robust safety margins in settlement placement, and a preference for redundancy in crucial systems. The redundancy was not mere waste, It was a way of making knowledge resilient by replicating it across multiple physical and social contexts. Preservation also took artistic forms. The Hyperboreans were masters of a technique we might call mnemonic sculpture, creating objects whose very patterns encoded complex information. A carved bone might contain an entire story of seasonal migration when read through a sequence of touches, and an embroidered textile could hold the hexametric rhythm of legal precedents. These mnemonic objects were both portable and tactile, designed for hands that might be numb from cold and eyes blinded by snow, and thus tailored to a sensory environment where touch often superseded sight. One of the civilization's wonders was their observatories, modest in outward appearance but precise in function. Built into shallow hills or nestled against rock faces, these observatories tracked slow stellar drifts and recorded the subtle tilt of the Earth's axis over generations. Inside them, instruments measured not only conventional astronomical phenomena but also faint magnetic perturbations, which the Hyperboreans connected to cycles of animal migration and sea behavior. Their cosmology blended sky and sea, star and ice, in a cohesive narrative that linked human fate to celestial memory. Their myths carried a strong sense of reciprocity with the heavens. Stories told of a great breath that settled the stars into pattern only once communities learned to sing certain harmonies into the night. These stories served multiple purposes. They were metaphors of social coordination and, at times, encoded instructions for aligning certain instruments with stellar markers. Thus the spiritual and the practical were braided so tightly that one could rarely be untied without loosening the other. Rituals around the solstices and equinoxes were elaborate, involving synchronized lights, chants, and small-scale engineering projects to reshape local thermal envelopes. During these times, the community came together to perform both ceremony and maintenance, repairing walls, recalibrating instruments, and refreshing mnemonic inscriptions with songs that renewed their memory. The lines between celebration and labor were deliberately blurred. Joy was not indulgence but a recognized method for consolidating collective skills and ensuring fidelity in transmission. The effect changed social life. Festivals doubled as apprenticeship modules and play became training. Their body of knowledge included medical practices surprisingly sophisticated for a society without certain surgical tools. They combined botanical knowledge with thermodynamic understanding, using warmed saline poultices and compressive techniques that leveraged ice itself as a sterile dressing. Healing rituals often involved elaborate stories that eased patients into cooperative breathing patterns, which reduced shock and allowed more effective treatment. The Titans in particular carried repertoire of calming chants used in triage, and those sounds had practical effects on heart rate and circulation, as well as a powerful moral effect in reminding patients they were not alone. Children in Hyperborean society apprenticed early to multiple crafts, learning by immersion rather than isolated schooling. From a very young age, they were taught to read landscapes in games, to memorize runs in songs, and to practice repair during play. The pedagogy was intentionally embodied. Knowledge lived in hands and lungs as much as in words. This method produced citizens whose reflexes were attuned to place and whose imagination was constantly trained in problem solving. The arts were similarly integrated into public life. Theater performances blended myth, mitigation, and instruction, using narrative to rehearse responses to danger and to normalize cooperation under strain. Music and movement were not distractions but rehearsal spaces where the community practiced emergency protocols disguised as drama. A play about a wayward glacier might teach evacuation routes and signal codes without ever mentioning the word evacuation. The learning was embedded in the effective architecture of the story. Their legal systems reflected the slow logic of their world. Rather than immediate punitive measures, justice often involved protocols of repair and restitution, oriented to restoring equilibrium to relationships and landscape alike. A theft might be resolved not by incarceration but by a ritual in which the offender publicly helped mend whatever had been harmed. These processes aimed to reintegrate rather than expel, because in the environmental context of the Hyperboreans, isolation often meant death. This made their jurisprudence necessarily rehabilitative and communal. The concept of leadership among them was different from the top-down models we often imagine. Leaders were selected for humility, the capacity to listen, and the skill of translating slow phenomena into actionable plans. Authority derived not from accumulation but from demonstrated fidelity to the community's memory and the ability to marshal distributed knowledge. Ceremonies for choosing leaders were intimate and exacting, often involving long periods of observation and multiple forms of consensus rather than single decisive votes. Violence existed, of course, but it took particular shapes in a society where resources were constrained and survival required cooperation. Conflict often centered on access to certain caches or disagreements over migration timing, and solutions were pragmatic, negotiated sharing, ritualized compensation, and occasionally neutral relocation of stakes to avoid escalation. The Arctic Titans sometimes served as adjudicators, not because they were enforcers but because their training allowed them to see effects over longer time frames and propose solutions that preserved the fabric of life. Stories of exile have a special resonance in a place where the land itself can be inhospitable. Exile was held as the most severe penalty because to be cast out was to cut someone off from the solidarities necessary for endurance. Exiled individuals often formed new microcommunities on the margins and sometimes came to be celebrated as daring innovators, but their path was always narrower and more weather-dependent. That knowledge mediated social conduct. People internalized cooperative norms because the personal risk of violation was a form of material vulnerability. The Hyperboreans had a complex relationship with death. Burial practices were designed to maintain the dignity of the body while also protecting the living from hazards associated with thawing permafrost. Many opted for above-ground cairns that connected the deceased to certain landscapes, and these cairns were often equipped with recorded chants and physical markers that told the person's story to future generations. Ancestors were not dead pages but active parts of communal memory. Their inscriptions were consulted in decisions large and small. One of the civilization's most haunting legacies was their careful attention to failed experiments. When an engineering intervention failed, a windbreak that redirected a current in unanticipated ways, or a canal that created unexpected melt, the community did not bury the attempt in shame. Instead, they ritualized the failure, codified its lessons into songs, and marked the site with a sculpted token that made the mistake visible for future readers. The practice reduced repetition of costly errors and turned humility into a technological virtue. There was, as well, a long tradition of dissent and internal critique. Not all Titans agreed on methods or priorities. Some argued for relocation to lower latitudes while others fought to hold ancestral ground with new engineering measures. These debates were intense and sometimes bitter, but the society valued argument as a necessary tool for adaptation. Because circulation of ideas relied on ritualized exchange, dissent had to enter the public arena through formally recognized channels, which ensured that even oppositional voices remained part of the collective conversation. Artistic innovation flourished under these tensions. New forms of music emerged in the context of debate, compositions that encoded dispute as counterpoint and resolution as harmonic arrival, and these musical models carried into civic life, offering metaphors for balancing opposing interests. The arts, therefore, were not decorative but instrumental in creating a social grammar for negotiation and change. Their myths also contained warnings, tales passed down that described hubris and the slow erosion of collective wisdom. One legend spoke of a builder who attempted to place a city of mirrors on thin ice, convinced that his reflections would create warmth. The mirrors shattered in the first spring and the city sank. The moral was about the limits of ambition and the necessity of humility when contending with systems too large to behold. Such stories were not simplistic moralizing but complex thought experiments with practical implications. We should imagine the Hyperborean festivals as seasons of concentrated invention, times when communities pooled resources to attempt larger-scale projects, redirecting a melt stream, experimenting with new compounds to stabilize permafrost, or installing a new line of signal mirrors. Collaborations across villages were common during these festivals, and they functioned as both laboratory and ritual. The projects were evaluated not only on their technical success, but also on their ability to foster social cohesion and sustain future practice. One enduring element of their culture was humility before the unknown. The Titans were trained to defer to evidence and to the cumulative judgments embedded in songs and ledgers, but they also accepted that certain aspects of the world might remain unknowable. Their approach to such mystery combined curiosity with restraint. They sought to understand without claiming dominion. That philosophical posture shaped their ethics, careful, patient, and oriented toward preservation rather than exploitation. As environmental stressors accumulated over centuries, the Hyperboreans experimented with various migration strategies. Some groups moved seasonally along narrow coastal corridors, while others established semi-permanent upland refuges designed to weather warmer periods. These migrations were complex operations that required coordination of food stores, mnemonic caches, and cross-community agreements to permit passage. The Titans often supervised such relocations, orchestrating the choreography of movement to maximize survival probabilities. These mass movements reshaped social networks and produced new cultural mixes as populations merged and redistributed their knowledge. New hybrid practices emerged, different languages folded together, mnemonic objects recombined, and once separate musical modes blended into novel harmonies. The process was uneven and sometimes fraught, but it also drove innovation and the creation of new social forms better adapted to altered climates. Amidst all this, there lingered another tension, the pressure of outsiders who coveted the Hyperboreans' knowledge and resources. Traders and conquerors from temperate regions were often baffled by the slow methods and ritualized forms of exchange, and some attempted to extract secrets by force or cunning. The Titans developed countermeasures, camouflaged caches, encrypted songs, and the deliberate release of misleading data to protect their core practices. These strategies were ethically fraught but understandable. The survival calculus sometimes necessitated secrecy in the face of predatory extraction. The archaeology of such a civilization, if one were to study it centuries later, would be baffling and beautiful in equal measure. Excavations would reveal layered deposits of composite ice, polished stones that bear acoustic properties, and textiles with embedded mnemonic codes. Interpreting these finds would require scholars to relearn how to read material culture as sound and story rather than merely as object. For an archaeologist trained in a different epistemology, the effort would be like learning a new sense. Over time, some Hyperborean communities became centers of transmission, nodes where knowledge converged and from which it was radiated outward. These hubs, small towns built around a repository or a great observatory, functioned as both think tanks and defensive keeps. They attracted itinerant smiths, singers, and healers seeking apprenticeship and sanctuary, and their influence often extended far beyond their modest physical footprints. They became cultural capitals, not by wealth but by density of practice. Within those hubs, a distinct rhetoric of care developed that treated knowledge as a commons to be stewarded rather than a commodity to be traded. Elders taught apprentices not simply techniques but ethical frameworks for considering the consequences of applying those techniques. Decisions were thus evaluated through multiple temporal lenses: immediate usefulness, generational impact, and long-term ecological coherence. This multiscalar thinking produced some of the most interesting innovations in their history. One of their long-term projects was to create reference archives that could survive both short-term violence and long-term decay. They engineered insulated vaults buried beneath permafrost and lined with reflective panels to minimize thermal fluctuation. Inside, they stored not only physical objects but encoded songs and carved mnemonics designed to be performed by arriving communities. The aim was to create a durable handoff mechanism, a way of speaking to future survivors in the language of gesture and sound that could be learned without extensive institutional continuity. The Arctic Titans' practice of guardianship evolved into a complex pedagogy of trust. Whenever a community accepted a Titan's counsel, it was implicitly committing to steward the knowledge in question. That trust was enforced not by coercion but by ritualized accountability. Community members would rehearse their obligations in public and demonstrate competencies in practical tests. Such performative accountability created social pressure for fidelity and formed the core of their reputational economy. The Hyperboreans also developed methods for dispersing knowledge to locations unlikely to be inherited intact. They would encode a skill across multiple mediums, song, quilt, carved bone, and a simple ritual, so that even if some mediums were lost, others could ferry the essentials forward. This redundancy, like duplicating keys in multiple locations, was not thoughtless. It was finely calibrated for the likely modes of loss in the Arctic environment. The result was an archival ecology, interdependent, awkward, and resilient. As you imagine these methods, imagine too the daily rhythms of life, long dawns where people gathered to plan, brief and intense afternoons of work, and solemn evenings where stories were sung and instruments tuned. The flow was punctuated by necessities, mending nets, calibrating instruments, checking caches, and by moments of ineffable beauty, when the aurora would unspool across the sky in velvet curtains and the world would feel temporarily aligned. Such moments reinforced the aesthetic grounding of the Hyperboreans' ethos. Beauty was not merely pleasurable but a sign that their interventions had harmonized with place. Their cuisine, though austere by tropical standards, displayed a refined logic of preservation and flavor layering. Food preparation involved freezing and slow salting, the use of fermented marine products, and the practice of warming certain roots in heated soils to coax out sugars. Meals were communal affairs, and dining rituals often doubled as mnemonic occasions. Recipes encoded migration schedules and curing timings, and the act of passing a dish followed a rhythm that trained hands for cooperative labor. Even eating, in other words, was a form of cultural transmission. Clothing was likewise practical and symbolic. Garments layered insulation with resonant threads and carried embroidered marks that identified lineage and role. Certain stitches acted as mnemonic devices, telling the wearer's story in a tactile code accessible to those trained in its reading. The care of clothing was a sanctified task. To mend garments was to mend reputation, and laundered robes were not simply cleaned but ritually renewed. In their art, a particular motif appears repeatedly, the spiral. Spirals symbolize cycles of weather and memory, the slow orbit of understanding around a central mystery. Artists carved spirals into door lintels and stitched them into blankets to remind the living that knowledge is not a line to be conquered but a circle to be tended. You find the spiral in their stories, in their maps, and in the architecture of their repositories, and it functions as an organizing metaphor for the culture. The Titans cultivated a unique morality of patience that is worth dwelling on. Patience, in their world, was not passivity but an active, disciplined engagement with time. It required resisting quick fixes, tolerating delay, and investing in futures that might not benefit the immediate actor. This ethic fostered intergenerational solidarity and produced institutions capable of stewarding information across long spans, something our hurried modern systems often struggle to do. Chemical innovations were modest but clever. They manipulated salts, certain organics from seaweeds, and mineral suspensions to create pastes that could fill fissures without cracking. These pastes behaved like living glue, expanding and contracting with freeze-thaw cycles in ways that minimized stress concentrations. The experiments yielded small triumphs, a repaired wall that lasted decades, or a canal that redirected melt in a gentler arc. Such incremental innovations were the backbone of their material resilience. Some titans developed an almost aesthetic reliance on limits. They preferred tools and techniques that allowed for graceful failures so that when things broke, they broke in ways that were reparable. This philosophy informed everything from the choice of fasteners to the beveling of beams. It was an aesthetic of mendability. The result was an architectural style that confessed its seams rather than hiding them, inviting continual maintenance and reshaping expectations about permanence. The role of humor in their society is often underestimated. Cold, when relentless, can erode morale, and the Hyperboreans used humor as a communal thermoregulator. Jokes and teasing were ritualized in certain social settings, functioning as stress tests for relationships and as informal reconciliations. Laughter softened the edges of austerity and created shared patterns of relief that reinforced social bonds. Their relationship to animals was both utilitarian and reverent. They hunted with care, selected herds for resilience rather than yield, and learned to listen to animal behavior as a form of intelligence about the landscape. Stories of animal teachers are common. In one tale, a seal supposedly taught a young hunter the rhythm of the tides by tapping a submerged stone in a sequence like Morse. Such tales encode practical observation into narrative charm, and they fostered an ethic of respect rather than domination. There were also sacred, and sometimes secret, knots and ropes used to encode complex protocols. By tying ropes in certain sequences and tensions, a titan could record an entire treaty or a multi-step engineering fixation. These knots were portable, resistant to decay, and taught to apprentices as mnemonic systems requiring manual dexterity and acute hearing. In the absence of paper and stable ink, such tactile codes were invaluable. Religious life, though varied, often centered on the custodial duty to the world. The primary ritual was not supplication but stewardship, a daily enactment of care wrapped in vows that renewed one's commitment to the land and to others. Priests, in this sense, were often community managers, organizing labor, mediating disputes, and keeping the mnemonic repertoire alive. Their temples were workshops as often as sanctuaries, places where the practical and the spiritual coexisted in continuous conversation. One should not romanticize their caution as mere conservatism. The Hyperboreans were inventive and experimental, but their experiments were embedded in social mechanisms that allowed for learning from failure. The slow timescale of their culture enabled deep iteration, and because knowledge was distributed across song and object, they could test innovations without risking catastrophic loss. Their method was iterative, communal, and attentive to feedback loops. The decline of their central institutions was not a single event but an accumulation of stresses, ecological shifts, external pressures, and the internal tensions of secrecy and sharing. In some places the repositories held and adapted, in others they were abandoned or repurposed. These trajectories are messy and instructive. They reveal the limitations of any system that must contend with both environmental volatility and human ambition. In some narratives, the Hyperboreans are portrayed as tragic victims of their environment, but that misses the nuance. There were survivors and adapters, innovators who persisted for many generations under conditions that would crush the unprepared. Their failures were instructive, their successes profound, and their legacy complex, a mixture of lost knowledge and living practices diffused into neighboring cultures. What remains compelling is not simply the end but the network of methods they devised for keeping knowledge alive. Modern scholars who study the Arctic Titans often find themselves changed by the work. The process of learning their songs and objects demands a different tempo of attention, a willingness to slow down and listen. Some visitors adopt their tutoring methods, learning to calibrate instruments with long listening sessions and to encode data into melody. These cross-cultural borrowings are testament to the value of their epistemology, a way of knowing that privileges duration and intimacy. Certainly there are dark chapters, episodes of internecine competition, appropriation by outsiders, and painful ethical compromises. These episodes remind us that no culture is pure or beyond critique. The Titans' decision to withhold certain techniques sometimes preserved them for the future, but sometimes prevented wider resilience building when it might have helped. The historical record insists we judge with both compassion and candor. What is enduring about the Hyperboreans is the set of questions they asked. How do we listen to a landscape? How do we encode memory in objects and people? How do we balance secrecy and sharing in a way that promotes survival? These questions remain urgent for us, even if the answers must be adapted to new scales and technologies. Their methods force us to consider knowledge as a living ecology rather than a commodity. If you picture the Arctic Titans now, imagine them standing at dawn, hooded and patient, tuning instruments that look like bones and strings while the first light writes itself across snow. They check their caches, sing a minor key that sets the day in rhythm, and then disperse to their tasks, repairing, teaching, listening. Their lives are disciplined by a steady cadence, and that cadence shapes a culture capable of living in dialogue with the slow, eerie intelligence of the frozen world. In imagining their demise or transformation, consider too the survivors, communities that absorbed their songs, smiths who learned their annealing, children who inherit their mnemonic objects. The Titans did not vanish so much as scatter their methods into a wide human ecosystem. Some practices became local, reinterpreted by new hands. Some techniques migrated into crafts and rituals with different names but similar functions. This diffusion, messy as it is, represents a kind of immortality. Listening to these stories invites practical lessons. We can emulate their patience in urban planning, their humility in resource use, and their commitment to distributed knowledge in designing resilient systems. We can borrow their ethic of repair and their preference for artifacts that mend gracefully. In doing so, we do not copy them, but we honor their method of relating knowledge to place and to time. And yet the most moving thing about the Hyperboreans might be their tenderness. In a world that demanded technical skill, they cultivated habits of care, repairing a neighbor's sledge not out of transaction but out of obligation to continuity, singing lullabies that encoded navigation, planting memorial stones that doubled as weather instruments. These small acts of devotion were the civilization's backbone and the reason their knowledge persisted as both object and story. As you continue your day, imagine the quiet work of a Titan mending a frayed rope by the light of a slow sun, humming a tune that calibrates a mirror, and listening for the faintest creak that might be a sentence from the earth. Those actions are not dramatic in the cinematic sense, but they are profound. They are the practice of thinking with the world rather than against it. They teach us that guardianship is patient labor, a long habit of attention and willingness to be changed by the very things we claim to protect. To close this section, not as an ending but as a passage to further reflection, take with you the recognition that advanced civilizations can look very different from our expectations. Complexity can be embodied in song and stitch as much as in code. The Arctic Titans were advanced in the ways that mattered to their world. They listened well, encoded memory subtly, and wove knowledge into the fabric of life. Their tale is an invitation to learn from forms of intelligence that prize slowness and reciprocity. And if you find yourself drawn to explore their vaults in imagination, remember to move gently. Their repositories prefer hands that touch with respect and ears that tune rather than dominate. In the quiet exchange between listener and story, the Hyperborean tradition persists. It asks only that we learn to hold time as they did, patiently, carefully, and with a devotion to the continuity of the living world. Listen to the wind for a moment, the thin, bright voice that rides over open ice and empty sea, and imagine it carrying not only cold but language, a vocabulary shaped by snow and long nights. The Hyperborean people, as the old stories say, learned to read that voice like a script, tracing its syllables in the ridges of frost and in the faint rings of ice around a frozen stone. Their cities rose where the wind told them to settle, places where the air itself seemed to have a memory. In those places, light bent and sang against facets of crystal as if answering old questions that had no name in other lands. This narrative begins not with a map but with sensation, a tactile memory of cold that presses against the skin and then becomes thought. Picture terraces of translucent towers, their surfaces like polished ice but warmer, holding a subtle glow from within, each building tuned like a resonant bell. The Hyperboreans carved their dwellings out of a living mineral, a crystal whose lattice held stories and numbers and laws like a ledger. Every corner, every corridor, was an archive and an instrument. To walk their streets was to play a city like an enormous, communal harp. The crystal cities were not cold in the way we understand cold, a mere absence of heat, but precise and deliberate, a climate of thought as much as temperature. Heat and light were channeled and modulated by the material itself, refracted into patterns that guided mood and movement, coaxing people toward contemplation, toward conversation, toward deeds measured against a communal standard. They prized balance and cadence. The urban plans were arranged like poems, lines of sight aligned to the rising of certain stars and the way the northern wind shifted in late winter. Anyone who stood at the city edge at dawn could see a choreography between cloud and crystal, an exchange of secrets minute as snowflakes. Those secrets were musical in origin. The Hyperborean lexicon included tones and timbres, a lexicon where the same vowel could mean a family of ideas depending on its pitch and echo. Children learned to speak with their breath, shaping small gusts into vowel patterns, and elders taught by whistling stories that only those who had listened for decades could fully translate. Language was not only sound but texture, the way consonants bit at the tongue like fine ice, the way vowels curved like frozen rivers. In that interplay, ethics and instruction were embedded, so that to speak without care was to mar the moral fabric of the city itself. There was a profound intimacy between craft and conviction among the Hyperboreans, an ethic that made form inseparable from function. A pot was not merely a vessel but a compact of cosmology, its glaze patterned with calendrical markers and seasonal proverbs. A garment was woven with threads that reflected not only weather but lineage, each stitch a mnemonic device for treaties and rites. Architecture followed the same logic. Every arch, every window, was a lesson arranged in 3 dimensions, a map that taught children to tell time by shadow and elders to read justice by the angle of light. Their understanding of time was elastic in a way that suited polar skies, long and patient, stitched with months of blue twilight. The Hyperboreans measured life in cycles of returning light and the slow growth of lichens, and the patience of glaciers that carved beds for rivers. Memory, therefore, assumed a public form. Memory banks were crystal halls where the past shimmered like preserved auroras, accessible by those initiated in the careful art of resonance. To consult those halls was to practice humility, for the stored echoes were not static artifacts but living advisors that answered only when questioned correctly. To ask correctly was to honor the past and imagine the future. Their rituals of questioning involved patterns of breath and sound, a choreography of approach that let the city's crystals respond productively. Sometimes an old question would return an unanticipated chord, a harmonic dissonance that demanded reinterpretation of law or myth. These surprises were not failures but invitations to adapt a tradition, to let the community reevaluate itself without losing contact with the lineage that had guided its growth. This is where the term wisdom takes on texture and weight, not a solitary flash of revelation but a communal process of attunement. The Hyperboreans cultivated minds like orchards, pruning, grafting, and cross-pollinating ideas until they bore the fruits that sustained a complex social life. Councils did not merely debate, they sang decisions into being, and the city's architecture amplified or softened those songs to test their resonance. The result was governance that favored longevity over immediate advantage, policies tuned to the slow arithmetic of ice and sea. Yet prudence did not make them pallid or parochial. Curiosity was a public virtue, an engine for exploration and invention that the cold amplified. They charted celestial patterns with tools that used crystal prisms to fold light into precise signatures, discovering correlations between star movements and subtle shifts in marine currents. Their maps were not flat but layered, a palimpsest of temporal strata where a coastline could be read in terms of both the last 100 years and the last 1,000 with equal clarity. They navigated by light and by memory, and their explorers returned with knowledge that altered agriculture and navigation alike. Agriculture in the Hyperborean lands was a study in resilience and ingenuity, a continuous negotiation with scarcity and opportunity. They coaxed symbiotic gardens out of sheltered ledges and geothermal vents, cultivating plants that thrived on the long shadows and short summers. These gardens were tended with rituals as precise as their law, songs that encouraged root growth, schedules that matched water delivery to the tides, and seeds that were rotated according to ethical directives. Food was seldom wasted, and consumption was part of a reciprocal covenant with land and sea. Every meal carried the cadence of gratitude and accounted for the seasons. The sea itself was both supermarket and oracle. Hyperborean fishermen read the ocean like a text, listening for the timbre of currents and the faint hum of shoals. They used nets woven with crystalline threads that both trapped fish and recorded traces of their passage, leaving behind patterns that younger generations would study as evidence of migration and health of the sea. These threads preserved not only catch histories but also the subtle chemical signatures of the waters, giving the city a kind of environmental memory that allowed it to predict shifts long before they became crises. Healing arts among the Hyperboreans drew on this ecological literacy. Their healers employed cold therapies that were at once material and metaphysical, using chilled crystals as focal points to slow fevers and sharpen thought. They practiced a slow medicine, where time-stretched convalescence was considered as much a cure as any salve. Illness was read as a misalignment, often between person and place, and treatment aimed to restore harmony with climate, community, and history rather than merely suppress symptoms. Music and ritual enacted that same integrative approach. Their ceremonies were not mere spectacle but technical procedures, sequences that recalibrated social bonds and oriented gatherings toward shared values. Instruments were carved from resilient bone and crystalline fibers, producing tones that could be felt as much as heard, a vibration that threaded through bodies and buildings. The music was cyclic, often returning to a motif that functioned like a communal heartbeat, reminding listeners of their continuity and their responsibilities to past and future kin. Art was at once documentary and prophetic. Wall friezes preserved migrations and treaties, but they also embedded hypothetical futures, plating images of potential consequences into present-day decisions. Sculptors worked with a patience most cultures found alien, allowing weather to complete their pieces over decades and sometimes centuries, trusting that the slow hand of nature could finish what a sculptor began. Their aesthetic philosophy held that beauty and truth revealed themselves in time, and so they deferred closure whenever possible, preferring works that invited ongoing interpretation. In matters of law, the Hyperboreans were famously deliberative. Legal hearings unfolded as long-form dialogues between parties, with elders acting as facilitators who guided the exchange with subtle tonal interventions. The crystalline halls amplified certain frequencies so that half-arguments could not hide behind brute volume. Truth tended to find audible expression, forcing clarity of intention. Punishments were restorative rather than punitive, designed to reintegrate offenders into the social fabric and to repair ruptures, physical or moral, with communal labor and ritual apology. Family structures were broad and adaptive, less rigidly nuclear than many southern civilizations, and more like webs than trees. Kinship was defined not only by blood but by shared responsibilities and dissolved obligations, which allowed individuals to belong to multiple overlapping households. This fluidity reinforced social safety nets and multiplied the channels through which wisdom could travel. Elders were respected not out of habit but because their knowledge was instrumental. They remembered routes, recipes, songs, and legal precedents that kept the community functioning across the long winters. Younger Hyperboreans, however, were not stifled by filial piety. Youthful invention was encouraged through apprenticeships that paired novices with masters in every craft, from crystal cutting to tide reading. Apprentices learned by doing under time-limited stewardship, and then they varied the method, contributing innovation without betraying the principle of continuity. It was a cultural economy of iterative improvement, small, accumulative changes that preserved the core of tradition while allowing new stresses and opportunities to be integrated. The Hyperborean calendar was itself an artifact of mind. Divided into slow arcs that matched daylight cycles and animal migrations, it was punctuated by festivals that functioned as civic checkpoints. During these times, the city paused and recalibrated, debts were reassessed, harvests shared, disputes aired, and songs retuned. These pauses prevented drift and allowed collective learning, community moments deliberately built into the year to update knowledge and adjust behavior. Education was not an isolated sphere but fused with everyday life. Children sat in kitchens and workshops, absorbing technical terms alongside nursery rhymes, learning the cadence of problem-solving in practical contexts. Lessons in ethics were folded into craft exercises, so that a potter's hand learned proportion and patience at the same moment as social responsibility. Even play was instructive. Games simulated scarce resource scenarios and forced cooperative strategies, making civic virtues as intuitive as motor skills. Myth mattered, and it did so because myths in Hyperborean culture were living hypotheses rather than static entertainments. Origin tales recalled a time when the world had been different, when lands were both more bountiful and more violent, and they served as simulations for contemporary choices. Listening to a myth was akin to running a social experiment. The community tested its assumptions against the moral scenarios embedded in story form. This turned storytelling into a form of public reasoning, where narrative variation functioned as experimentation. In this theater of thought, the figure of the North Wind took on a complex symbolic life. Sometimes gentle and rich with fish-scented air, and sometimes fierce, a blade that stripped warmth from flesh, the North Wind was an interlocutor that taught respect for limits. Poetry addressed it as a guide and as a reprimand, asking the wind to spare the young and to remember previous pacts. People negotiated with it indirectly by changing practices. They shifted migration paths of herds, they altered the timing of fishing, they adjusted the patterns of consumption. The wind refracted their humility back at them through weather and sea, and this feedback loop became central to their moral cosmology. The Hyperboreans were adept at controlled transformation, a cultural engineering that balanced reverence with intervention. They manipulated landscapes gently, building terraces to slow runoff, opening channels to redirect meltwater in ways that fed gardens without eroding the high places. Their tools were precise and rarely violent, designed to work with glacial rhythms rather than against them. This ethic extended to interpersonal relations. They preferred negotiation over conquest, restoration over retribution, and maintenance over demolition. In matters of knowledge transmission, they developed what might be called a mnemonic technology using crystal matrices. These constructs stored encoded patterns of light and sound, preserving songs and legal codes in material form. At first glance, these devices appeared ornamental, but their surfaces refracted light into sequences that a trained listener could read as melody and memory. Younger practitioners learned to decode the matrices by touch and breath, rehearsing the notes until the city itself hummed with shared recollection. There was also exquisite craftsmanship in their weaponry, if weapons is the right word. The Hyperboreans crafted tools for deterrence with an aesthetic that discouraged aggression. Their blades were often ceremonial, shaped to cut hair or ribbon in ritual rather than flesh. When conflict did escalate, contests were staged as displays of skill and endurance rather than totalizing violence, rituals designed to settle grievances without wholesale destruction. The result was a culture that minimized the frequency and scale of violent confrontation while keeping the capacity for defense intact. Trade extended beyond the ice into the temperate regions, and those exchanges reshaped both sides. Traders bore salt and seeds and stories, and they carried back textiles, pigments, and ideas. These contacts were managed with formal hospitality rituals that governed reciprocity carefully so that trade did not become dependency. Gifts were often symbolic, embedding obligations and a reminder that mutual esteem maintained balance, favored reciprocity, and reduced the temptation for exploitative relationships. Religion, to the extent the word applies, evolved as philosophy did, practical, observational, and speculative. Their spiritual practices enshrined reciprocity and the sanctity of limits, insisting that even the most gifted of their people owed the community a steady return of knowledge and labor. Temples were open to anyone seeking instruction rather than being exclusive sanctuaries for a priestly caste. Clerics were more like librarians and mediators, their authority grounded in competence and recognized service rather than mysterious inheritance. One of their most enigmatic practices was the annual silence, a period when speech was greatly reduced and many interactions relied on gestures, rhythm, and symbolic exchange. This was not asceticism for its own sake, but an experiment in slowing the mind and cultivating attention. During silence, communities practiced deep listening, learning to discern subtler distinctions in breath and tone that could otherwise be drowned out by the daily din. Many believed that this interval sharpened judgment and helped decision-makers hear the city's old echoes more clearly. Science and metaphysics were not strictly separated. Observation fed philosophy and philosophy guided experimentation. They studied light, sound, and crystalline resonance with rigorous curiosity, inventing instruments that turned subtle phenomena into measurable data. Yet they framed those inquiries within a commitment to humility, treating knowledge as stewardship rather than domination. Where other civilizations might have sought control, the Hyperboreans sought attunement, aiming to harmonize human needs with planetary processes. Their cosmology included a sophisticated sense of planetary interdependence, an early articulation of what we now call ecology. They observed predator-prey patterns, algal blooms, and the slow receding of ice with a patient record-keeping that allowed them to anticipate changes with surprising accuracy. Their forecasts were not always perfect, of course, and their archives preserve entries of surprise and error, occasions of honest revision that strengthened subsequent models. Learning from failure was institutionalized as a collective virtue, and such failures were studied with the same care as successes. Stories of expansion and contraction are present throughout their history. There were periods of population growth when the climate warmed slightly and migration opportunities opened. There were times of retreat when colder decades compressed habitation into fortified hubs. These population ebbs and flows were not moral judgments but conditions to be navigated. Each shift demanded reconfiguration of resources, renegotiation of kinship bonds, and sometimes new treaties with neighboring peoples and species. The archaeological record that survives in our time offers tantalizing glimpses but little easy certainty. Submerged ruins, glittering like reefs beneath northern seas, hint at structures whose lines defy simple categorization. Excavations have unearthed crystal shards that bear the faint echo of ancient songs, and thin slabs carved with pictographs that suggest calendar keepers. These artifacts are partial, fragmentary. The narrative we reconstruct is assembled from shards, and the gaps are as meaningful as the pieces because absence speaks to loss and transformation. Modern investigators sometimes romanticize the Hyperboreans as noble geniuses, a dangerous temptation that flattens complexity. The truth is messier. Their society contained power imbalances, disputes, jealousies, and failings, as any human group does. There were instances of exclusion and error, moments when the city's systems privileged particular families or interpretations. Recognizing that complexity makes their achievements more instructive, for it shows how resilient institutions were forged amid imperfection, not in spite of it. Language scholars who study Hyperborean inscriptions wrestle with a grammar that is both concrete and symbolic, where a word can be a precise technical instruction and a moral injunction simultaneously. Translators debate how much of the meaning is lost without social context. A law that appears dry on a tablet may have been enforced by a festival or a song that imbued it with flexibility. The ambiguity is deliberate, critics say. The language was crafted to accommodate nuance, to allow exceptions through ritual, and to prevent absolutism. Musicologists have found in Hyperborean scales a system based on intervals that align with the harmonics of crystal resonances, a sonic logic tied to their materials. Instruments exploit overtone series in ways that maximize the city's acoustic ecology, creating music that can be heard clearly within the massive halls and by those who stand outside in the wind. Their compositions favor slow, evolving textures over sudden modulation, mirroring their social preference for gradual, consensual change rather than abrupt upheaval. Philosophically, the Hyperboreans developed a set of precepts that we might call the ethics of tempered response, to answer stress with measured adaptation, to respect scarcity by refining allocation, and to cultivate foresight by institutionalizing reflection. These guidelines were taught in multiple genres: proverb, law, chant, and architecture, so they were deeply embedded in cognition. As a result, their culture was geared to prevent runaway behaviors, to create buffers against scarcity, and to distribute knowledge widely so that no surprise could incapacitate the entire community. Technologically, they innovated in materials science without losing their aesthetic priorities. Crystal engineering produced surfaces that were both functional and beautiful, creating facades that responded to weather by moderating interior climates. They developed glazing techniques that filtered harmful radiation and redistributed warmth, and they exploited subtle thermal flows to power small mechanical systems. Their machines were rarely large. They valued distributed, reparable devices that could be maintained by many hands rather than centralized engines that required rare expertise. The problem of leadership in this society was handled with an eye toward rotation and accountability. Offices were often term-limited, with ceremonial handovers that rehearsed humility rather than dominance. Leaders were expected to be proficient in a craftsman-like set of skills and to keep their authority contingent on demonstrable competence. This discouraged heredity as an exclusive path to power and allowed merit to circulate through the ranks, reducing stagnation and concentrating authority modestly but effectively. Ceremonial life was rich with paradoxes: public displays that celebrated modesty, pageants that rehearsed restraint, and festivals that marked abundance with rituals of equitable sharing. Those paradoxes served as moral training, teaching people to hold multiple values in tension rather than to flatten them into slogans. Public attention was trained to subtleties. Citizens practiced recognizing the difference between ruthless thrift and prudent conservation, between bold innovation and reckless change. Their relationship with animals was reciprocal and framed by kinship metaphors. Herds were not owned in the exclusive sense but tended as community commons, with rules governing slaughter, breeding, and movement. Predators were respected for their ecological role, sometimes given offerings to maintain balance, and hunting was regulated by seasons and ritual. Respect did not mean sentimentalism but a nuanced stewardship that recognized animals as participants in a shared biome. Trade routes that stretched beyond the Hyperborean margins reveal a people both pragmatic and hospitable, adept at diplomacy and cautious exchange. Caravans and ships carried not only goods but also codified rituals of reciprocity, paving ways for mutual learning. Contacts with neighbors produced syncretic technologies and customs that were adapted to fit Hyperborean constraints, showing flexibility and an appetite for selective assimilation. That diplomacy softened potential conflicts and created networks that could be mobilized in times of environmental stress. Their myths sometimes speak of a distant time when the crystalline cities were young and the world less divided, a golden age where the wind sang uninterrupted and the ice lent itself to easy travel. Such myths served as anchors for aspiration rather than as literal blueprints for governance. They were used as heuristics in decision-making, reminding leaders of what to preserve and what to avoid. When contingency struck, unanticipated storms, invasive species, or political strife, they returned to these myths to test new responses within a moral frame. The fall of certain Hyperborean cities, for those that did fall, was often complex and drawn out rather than an instant catastrophe. Shifts in sea current, prolonged droughts in food gardens, or sudden introduction of new pathogens could compound with political missteps to create crises. Sometimes the cities contracted and reconfigured, relocating to higher terraces or consolidating into fewer but more robust settlements. The archaeological signatures of collapse show improvisation and adaptation rather than total societal failure, a testament to their cultural emphasis on repair and renewal. Modern explorers descended into some of these ruins and found not silence but traces of voices embedded in crystal shards, like songs trapped and muffled by time. Scientists with sensitive instruments have teased apart resonances that may be echoes of ancient melodies or recordings of environmental data. These discoveries raise questions about who has the authority to interpret and possess this material heritage, a question that echoes the Hyperboreans' own concerns about stewardship and communal access. Ethical debates swirl around the excavation and display of Hyperborean artifacts, particularly when these artifacts hold functional cultural knowledge rather than mere aesthetic value. Some argue that certain technologies should remain under communal control, used for local benefit rather than exploited commercially. Others insist that knowledge should be shared widely to advance science and to honor the principle that learning resists proprietary confinement. These debates are humbling because they mirror the original culture's dilemmas: how to balance openness with protection. The dream of reconstructing Hyperborean music has driven collaborations between ethnomusicologists, acousticians, and sculptors, producing instruments inspired by shards and accounts that attempt to recreate ancient timbres. Playback studies in reconstructed halls have shown that some frequencies interact with human physiology in subtle ways, lowering heart rates or sharpening concentration. Whether those effects are cultural conditioning or physiological reaction, they illuminate the depth of the Hyperborean design. Social spaces engineered to influence mood and cognition for the benefit of communal deliberation. Language revitalization projects attempt to revive fragments of Hyperborean speech for academic study and for cultural connection with descendant communities. These efforts must tread carefully, though, balancing the urge to recover with an ethic of respect for living traditions that may have diverged. Linguistic reconstruction is part detective story, part community service, and part moral reckoning about who owns stories and who can speak them. The act of revival becomes itself a contemporary ritual that tests modern commitments to humility and shared responsibility. Philosophers find in Hyperborean texts a challenge to modern assumptions about progress and accumulation. The Hyperborean maxim that less can be more appears repeatedly, not as ascetic denial but as a strategic allocation that values quality of life and resiliency. Their approach to accumulation discouraged hoarding and celebrated circulation, a principle that has surprising resonance for contemporary debates about sustainability. In other words, their wisdom suggests alternatives to the belief that each increase in material throughput is inherently good. Scholars who study their governance propose that the Hyperboreans designed institutions around error correction, anticipating the inevitability of mistakes and building repair mechanisms into the law. Courts allowed for reconsideration, councils could reverse prior votes under specified conditions, and the archival system recorded not only the law but the reasoning behind it. This metadocumentation allowed future generations to learn why a decision had been made and whether its premises still held, embodying a philosophy of institutional humility. The material culture of beauty in public life matters here. Crystal plazas that refracted communal light into patterns that reminded citizens of their entangled obligations. Public art was not merely decoration but pedagogy. It taught proportion, history, and civic values with subtlety and grace. Citizens were constantly exposed to reminders of interdependence, and this ambient pedagogy contributed to a shared sense of identity over time. Their pedagogy of repair was literal in craft and metaphorical in society. Workshops were public spaces where broken objects were brought for communal mending as much as for technical restoration. The act of repair was ritualized, with songs and recitations that reinscribed the object's history into the communal ledger. Restoration was therefore not only practical but moral, teaching patience, empathy, and respect for continuity. The Hyperborean ethical imagination extended to their treatment of strangers and newcomers. Hospitality rules were codified to avoid exploitation, but they also permitted generosity that was measured and sustainable. New arrivals were integrated through shared labor and instruction, given responsibilities that ensured their survival but also made them contributors to the collective fortunes. This reciprocal model mitigated the risks associated with migration and allowed cultural innovation to enter without uprooting the social balance. Memory, physical and social, was distributed widely in the Hyperborean world. Archives existed in many forms: songs, architecture, stone tablets, and crystalline matrices, so that the loss of any single repository did not doom the community's recollection. This redundancy in cultural memory is a lesson for modern data systems. Diversifying storage and embedding knowledge widely reduces vulnerability. The idea that memory should be protected through multiplicity, not monopolized, is one of their most enduring teachings. Their science of ice offers practical insights even today. The Hyperboreans observed how microstructures within ice influenced its behavior and designed foundations that adjusted to slow creep rather than resist it. Modern engineers might learn from these techniques about building in fragile landscapes, designing structures that flex and accommodate long-term shifts rather than imposing brittle rigidity. The subtle engineering solutions of their cities were often hidden in the aesthetics, where decorative joints served as expansion seams and patterned walls redirected meltwater into gardens. Artists have been inspired by the Hyperborean aesthetic, producing works that mimic the interplay of transparency, light, and pattern that defined the old cities. These reinterpretations are not mere nostalgia, they explore how aesthetic principles can inform modern sustainability practices, such as using light management to reduce energy consumption. Art becomes a bridge between past wisdom and present innovation, showing how beauty can carry practical knowledge across time. The ethical tension between preservation and innovation appears repeatedly in their story. The Hyperboreans prized techniques passed down unchanged but also cultivated a culture of responsible variation, encouraging practitioners to modify tools and practices within explicit ethical bounds. This balance avoided both ossification and reckless change, offering a model for how tradition and progress can coexist when institutions prioritize accountability and future harm reduction. Among the more challenging aspects of their legacy is the way they dealt with scarcity-induced competition for resources, where the temptation to centralize control in times of stress had to be resisted. Their answer was to decentralize authority, empower local custodians, and keep communication channels open so that localized crises could be addressed without imposing catastrophic central demands. This networked resilience is a motif worth examining for contemporary disaster planning. Their funerary customs reflect an attitude toward death that is respectful without being fearful, combining science and ritual in ways that comfort the living and conserve material sensibly. Bodies were treated with reverence, nutrients were recycled through designated gardens, and memorial crystals were embedded with the deceased's favorite songs or stories to sustain communal memory. Grief was communal and ritualized, allowing the bereaved to mourn within structures that emphasized continuity and the persistence of social roles. The Hyperboreans were not monolithic. Different city-states emphasized different values and developed unique local variations on shared themes. Some favored stricter ritual hierarchies and ornate ceremonial forms, while others preferred minimalist practices and egalitarian governance. This diversity created intellectual competition and cross-pollination that enriched the culture as a whole. It also complicated historical reconstruction, since what we call Hyperborean wisdom is an amalgam collected from distinct and sometimes contradictory practices. When modern scientists reverse engineer ancient technologies, they are often astonished by the integration of aesthetics and utility in even mundane objects. A spoon might be carved with feed patterns for communal meals. A measuring device might feature inscriptions that instruct proper ethical use. This blending suggests that the Hyperboreans embedded moral training into everyday life, using objects as small-scale tutors that constantly reminded citizens of obligations and best practices. Their rituals for climate sensing were both scientific and poetic. Observers practiced a disciplined attentiveness to pattern and anomaly, marking changes in cloud texture, ice creek, and fish behavior in registries that combined empirical detail with metaphor. Young apprentices were taught to narrate observations in lyrical forms to improve recall, transforming observational data into memorable phrases that could be transmitted quickly and accurately across teams. This hybrid method enhanced both retention and interpretation. The Hyperborean culinary arts deserve attention for how they turned scarcity into creativity. They developed preservation techniques that used humidity, salt, and cold to extend the life of foods with minimal energy input, and they created flavor traditions that balanced subtle tastes in ways that magnified satisfaction from small portions. Meals were social pedagogy. The way food was prepared and eaten taught moderation, respect, and reciprocity, reinforcing values across generations with each shared course. Their calendar rituals included exercises in future projection, community gatherings that asked participants to imagine worst-case and best-case scenarios and to plan contingencies accordingly. These exercises were not fanciful but practical. They generated lists of resources to stock, skills to teach, and compromises to accept. By rehearsing future possibilities aloud, communities softened the shock of change and built shared expectations that made coordinated responses faster and less contentious. The Hyperborean practice of openly recording dissent contributed to institutional robustness. Dissenting voices were archived and consulted later, a practice that prevented intellectual complacency and allowed alternative strategies to be tested. This institutional respect for creative disagreement was coupled with norms for respectful expression, so that critique did not descend into rancor. The effect was a culture that welcomed controlled challenge as a mechanism for improvement. In the arts of leadership, they valued the capacity to listen more than the ability to command. Leaders were chosen for their deliberative temperament, their patience in consulting archives, and their willingness to change opinion in light of new evidence. Leadership training was rigorous but accessible, involving long apprenticeships, public accountability, and ceremonial humility. This approach produced leaders who were skilled technicians of consensus and who understood authority as a trust, not a prize. Their rituals of recombination, ceremonies that remixed older songs, dances, and brow patterns into new ensembles, kept cultural forms alive without keeping them static. These recombination events were inventive spaces where the past was treated as raw material for present needs, a process that allowed cultural continuity to be creative rather than fossilized. People learned to honor origin while allowing form to evolve, an approach that valued memory while permitting adaptation. On a metaphysical level, they understood knowledge as a shared light that needed tending. The crystal matrices that stored data were maintained collectively, and their maintenance was a civic ritual performed by rotating teams who cleaned, tuned, and annotated each piece. This communal approach prevented gatekeeping and ensured that the city's memory remained responsive to new insights and corrections. The practice read knowledge as ongoing work rather than a possession to be guarded. The Hyperborean emphasis on humility extended to their technological aspirations. They avoided grand schemes that would reshape climates or force ecosystems, preferring incremental interventions that could be tested and reversed. They called this modest engineering, a philosophy that measures impact before scaling and that prefers redundancy over singular innovation. In a modern context, that principle offers a counterpoint to large-scale projects that ignore local complexity. Their festivals of renewal were carefully timed to ecological cycles and designed to distribute resources and recalibrate social accounts. During these times, debts might be forgiven or renegotiated, and labor obligations could be shifted to allow rest and celebration. These traditions prevented cumulative resentment and fostered resilience by allowing the social ledger to be balanced periodically. The rituals also reinforced values of reciprocity and communal responsibility through symbolic gestures enacted in shared space. The Hyperboreans also developed complex ways to care for their elders, integrating aging into social life rather than segregating it. Elders were repositories of time-sensitive knowledge and were consulted not merely as symbols but as practical resources. The community invested in their comfort and accessibility. This investment had pragmatic and ethical dimensions. It preserved granular knowledge and expressed a cultural commitment to the dignity of life across stages. Archaeological debates about the end of certain Hyperborean chapters continue to stir controversy. Some propose sudden climatic shocks as primary drivers, while others argue for the role of disease, socio-political fragmentation, or resource mismanagement. The most plausible readings synthesize these factors, revealing cascading effects where small shocks amplified through social networks into systemic change. Such complexity cautions against single-factor explanations and underscores the value of multidisciplinary investigation. Language and music scholars continue to find new correlations between inscriptions and acoustic patterns that suggest integrated notation systems combining glyph and tone. Deciphering those codes is painstaking, requiring collaboration across fields imaginable to the Hyperboreans' own polymaths. Each breakthrough refines our view of their cognitive ecology, a culture that made sense of the world through multiple, interlocking modalities. The result is a richer sense of what it means for a civilization to think with and through its environment. Many modern communities studying Hyperborean models seek practical lessons for contemporary climate adaptation, civic design, and ethical technology. They find inspiration in the artful combination of pragmatism and humility, and the social architectures that emphasize repair, sharing, and accountability. But inspiration must be adapted, not adopted wholesale. The conditions of polar antiquity differ from those of modern megacities. Thoughtful translation, not romantic replication, is the challenge facing those who would learn from the north wind. Museums and cultural institutions wrestle with how to present the Hyperboreans without flattening their moral complexity. Exhibits that highlight their innovation sometimes underplay the social processes that made that innovation ethical and durable. The best displays combine artifacts with narratives that emphasize institutional design, communal labor, and the role of ritual in sustaining knowledge systems. Such exhibitions become pedagogical interventions, asking viewers to consider what cultural design means for our present and future. There is an enduring aesthetic lesson in their craftsmanship, that utility becomes sustainable when it is beautiful and that beauty gains meaning when it serves public purposes. The crystalline surfaces that housed memory and music were chosen not for ostentation but to make daily life remindful and sacred. Living amid such artifacts shapes behavior subtly. Aesthetics can be a gentle but persistent teacher, steering choices through ambient experience rather than coercion. In capitals and universities, academics debate whether the Hyperboreans were a single culture or a confederation of allied polities sharing a common ecological philosophy. The evidence tilts toward confederation, a network of city-states linked by trade, ritual calendars, and shared institutions that allowed each locality room for innovation. That network model is itself instructive, suggesting ways to design contemporary federations that respect local autonomy while enabling collective action. The Hyperborean concept of property was nuanced. Objects were sometimes personal, sometimes communal, and sometimes considered custodial trusts for future generations. This layered view of possession eased social tensions and promoted stewardship of critical resources. It aligned with their broader ethic that no one generation had absolute entitlement, a perspective that encouraged long-term thinking about resource allocation and cultural preservation. Reflections on their environmental practices reveal a culture that treated ecosystems as partners rather than mere supplies. They used observation to fit policy to rhythm, adjusting hunting, planting, and harvesting practices in step with multi-decade trends. This kind of flexible management preserved biodiversity and maintained the services ecosystems provided. Through codified patience, they kept their world viable for generations. Many modern artists, philosophers, and policymakers continue to mine Hyperborean practices for metaphors and mechanisms. Some borrow their musical laws, experimenting with spaces designed to amplify communal thought. Others study their calendars as models of civic pacing, introducing ritual pauses that create opportunities for public recalibration. None of these adoptions is simple, but each points to the value of translating old wisdom into contemporary practice in ways respectful of context and modernity. In time, the ruins themselves became a field of pilgrimage for those seeking quiet and counsel, much as they were in their own time. Travelers who make the long journey north report a peculiar clarity in the air, a sense that the landscape itself holds questions and answers. These pilgrimages are acts of learning and of reconciliation, attempts to attune oneself to a different tempo and to be taught by the slow, patient intelligence embodied in stone and ice. The north wind remains a recurrent figure in our speculation about climate, culture, and ethics. We may imagine it as a teacher still, blowing across the shards of their cities and reminding us of limits, mutual obligation, and the possibility of careful invention. Listening to that wind invites not submission but responsiveness, a challenge to design our own institutions with humility and foresight. The Hyperboreans did not achieve perfection, but they created an enduring experiment in living with scarcity, and their echoes continue to instruct us. As you drive or go about your day, Take a moment to imagine walking through a plaza of living crystals, feeling the city hum with coordinated breath. Think of elders teaching by song, of children learning by shaping the wind with their mouths, and of councils that sang laws into being and then tested them against the tide. Consider how architecture, ritual, governance, and ethics can be composed to remain flexible and accountable, and how the northern wind might, even now, whisper counsel to anyone willing to listen. Far beyond the familiar map, where the sun schemes the horizon and daylight bleeds into a cold that seems to last forever, lay the realm the poets called Hyperborea. It was a land of blue ice and black noon, where mountains were folded like the ribs of sleeping gods and rivers of frozen glass ran between citadels of carved snow. To arrive there was to understand that the world kept other rhythms, and that beneath the frost lived people who had learned to make warmth out of silence. They called themselves many names across the ages, but to outsiders they were simply the Hyperboreans, a civilization that rose beneath auroral skies and fashioned a wonder of architecture, language, and craft that defied the usual logic of empires. Their cities had the pale austerity of glaciers and the meticulous carving of hands that had been practicing for generations. Towers of packed snow and stone rose like teeth, their exteriors etched with spirals that caught the starlight and held it long enough for messages to travel. The first travelers to speak of them described corridors warm with breathing, chambers lined with lenses that refracted the thin sun into halls of gentle radiance. They told of steam gardens, of subterranean groves lit by algae that pulsed faint green, and of halls where people gathered to share tales wrapped in furs. There was no heat without purpose, and no purpose that did not fit like puzzle pieces into the survival of a people who had learned to weave daylight into industry. In the beginning their science was simple and survivalist, but necessity is a relentless teacher. The Hyperboreans tamed winds that would have broken the strongest timbers of southern ships, and they dug into the earth to coax warmth from the deep. They shaped ice not as a barrier but as a living material, tempering and smoothing it until it held light and sound. The result was a culture both austere and lavish, where the economy of warmth produced elaborate rituals and exacting craftsmanship. This civilization's political map was a lattice of principalities, walled enclaves, and trading leagues, each clinging to its own dialects and customs even as they intermarried and exchanged amber, whale oil, and salt. There was a central court known as the Meridian, a loose confederation whose authority rose from consensus and the ancient right of those who could read the skies. Power there was not absolute, but persuasive. It worked through ceremony, maritime law, and the often invisible threads of marriage alliances. By the time the first creaking southern navies cast their eyes northward in search of routes, the Hyperboreans had long since perfected a maritime technology suited to ice as much as to sea. Their ships were not simply hulls and sails but living things with hulls reinforced by composite ice, ribs of whalebone, and keels hung with glass prisms to patch and redirect light into the hull. These vessels could slip under pack ice and erupt into open water like seals, and they carried cargoes of mineral lumens, furs, and delicately worked mirrors. The age of contact brought merchants, missionaries, spies, and the inevitable greed that touches all human endeavors. Out of curiosity came conflict, and out of conflict came the machinery of war. Where southward kingdoms imagined cold as a relentless enemy to be endured, the Hyperboreans considered it a partner to be understood, a force to be harnessed. That philosophical divide was subtle at first, but it hardened into rival doctrines as resources became scarce and as alliances shifted. Tensions coalesced like frost on glass into what would be remembered as the Frozen War, a long, grinding conflict that dragged empires into a landscape grown hostile and poetic with cold. Historians later argued about its causes, pointing to depleted southern supplies, a catastrophic failure of harvests in a temperate belt, and a series of religious edicts that made expansion seem like destiny. The practical reasons were joined by mythic narratives, omens seen in auroral curtains, a prophecy interpreted by a meridian priestess, and a contested relic said to hold the memory of the first thaw. The sparking of war was not a single moment but a season of small violences, raids that burned storehouses, the cutting of supply lines, a sabotage of a southern cathedral that used Hyperborean reflectors to redirect light into its stained glass and shatter it. Each act fed fear and hardened policy until rulers felt they had no option but to act with force. Empires, once prudently indifferent, marshaled fleets and trained fleets of sleds and wagon ships, and the first skirmishes erupted along frozen straits where sea and ice fought for dominance. The battlefield of the Frozen War was not a single plain but an array of theaters stitched across polar margins, narrow fjords where light played tricks, tundra plains that swallowed horses, and plateaus where battle lines braided with fissures of old glaciers. Commanders learned quickly that tactics for warm fields failed spectacularly in the cold. Cavalry charges foundered when hooves clipped and broke through thin ice, and artillery designed for softer earth was useless against packed permafrost. Hyperborean military thought evolved around the principle of integration with the environment. They placed their fortifications not atop open ground but in the lee of glaciers, where creeping ice could be guided to funnel attackers into natural traps. Their engineers sculpted ice walls that flexed rather than shattered, embedding bronze catches and timber beams that expanded with cold. When the enemy struck, those walls emitted groaning sounds like mourning that frightened horses and unnerved men and used to the living noises of frozen architecture. The southern empires adapted their own ways to fight the cold. They learned to lay heated tracks for artillery, to coat their soldiers' boots in resin and cloth to avoid frostbite, and to invent tents with layered skins that trapped body heat. Supply chains developed new rituals, sled trains wrapped in fish oil to repel the worst burn of wind, runners who moved with the speed and stealth of wolves, and messages carved on ice and left to melt and be read downstream. The logistics of winter war became an art as decisive as the tactics of battle. Combat was brutal, but it was also restrained by a code that had no analog in southern battlefields. The Hyperboreans, despite their mastery of the cold, retained a deep reverence for the land they fought over. There were prohibitions against leaving carcasses to rot on snow because that would blight the sacred whiteness, and there were rules about taking children or burning groves that had been planted under the meridian's blessing. These codes shaped campaigns and sometimes spared lives in ways that Southerners found baffling. Yet the war produced horrors beyond any code. Siege weapons slung scorching oil that turned to glass on contact and entombed men in transparent coffins. Mines bored into the ice released cold that accelerated, an alchemy that made the ground beneath cities snap and tilt. Entire districts would slip into crevasses during a night, their roofs and the people under them swallowed by a shifting silence that left only an unmarked sweep in the snow. Leadership in this age was theatrical and fatal. There were generals who were also poets, and rulers who rode to the front wrapped in pelts and wore detritus from fallen foes as trophies. One famed admiral claimed to have navigated a convoy by reading the stars through gaps in auroral bands, and his legend spread until it melted into myth. Such figures mattered because the psychological weather was as important as the meteorological weather. Morale could freeze or thaw an army faster than any cannon. Espionage took on forms that matched the climate. Spies learned to read tracks of migrating beasts, to interpret the placement of snowdrifts, and to move in ways that left no trace. They concealed messages inside blocks of ice that could be melted or left for allies, and they recruited guides among the nomadic peoples who knew hidden passes. The intelligence game in an environment that punished mistakes was subtle and often relied on local knowledge rather than grand stratagems. One of the enduring images of the Frozen War was the siege of a city called Pharaoh Nu, a place hollowed from iceberg and bedrock, its courtyards rimed with hoarfrost that caught the morning like a net. The attackers surrounded the city for months, sending sappers to undermine bastions and attackers to peek through catwalks. The defenders responded with a quiet ferocity, releasing captive heat from stores that had been preserved for exactly such a calamity and countermining into the attackers' camps. The siege became a test of endurance, a slow chess match with people as the pieces and ice as the board. Food ran low and rationing introduced new languages of barter among the citizens, who traded family heirlooms for pieces of meat and for needles to repair furs. When a southern commander finally ordered a frontal assault, the defenders used sealed chambers that vented hot steam into the attackers' faces, the sudden warmth followed by freezing blasts that numbed hands and dropped weaponry. The assault collapsed into disarray, and what was left behind was a field of shapes frozen in grotesque poses like a gallery of brittle statues. Across the war's many years there were episodes of art and tenderness that punctured the siege-weary nights. Correspondence between lovers riveted with frost was heated in chambers to read. Poets wrote in ciphers about the sunlight trapped in whale oil lamps. Children born during the war learned lullabies that spoke of ships as mothers and of snow as a blanket of ancestors. These human moments undercut the grand narratives of strategy and reminded both sides of what they were defending, not only land but a measure of home. Economies under siege rerouted ingenuity into new crafts. Artisans who once made fine glass lenses began to produce snow shields, thin panes treated to neither fog nor crack, that allowed lookouts to scan horizons without exposure. Metal workers learned to temper bronze in brine baths to prevent embrittlement, and tailors stitched garments with secret packs that could be filled with hot stones for warmth on forced marches. These innovations spread quickly, and the war itself accelerated technological blending in a manner historians later called a cold renaissance. Religion and myth were not mere backdrops but active tools in the contest. Priests interpreted auroral motions as portents and blessed ice roads to ensure safe passage for caravans. Shrines were moved from villages to the mountains, where the noise of war could not drown the small chanting of priests. Sometimes salvation was offered in the form of gifts, a rare thaw that softened a road at just the right time, or a long frozen night reduced to a tolerable hush. Such events were read as signs and used to rally armies or to call for ceasefires. The diplomacy that threaded through warfare was a strange mixture of brittle formalities and deeply pragmatic deals. Envoys traveled in sealed sleds, bearing treaties carved into whale ivory. Negotiations took place under the sign of a temporary truce called the White Council, where representatives shared saltless bread and traded information as if it were currency. These councils could change the course of campaigns overnight when a single agreement reopened a supply route or ceded a resource-rich island in exchange for peace. There were betrayals that had the weight of legends. A commander who had promised to hold a pass was tempted by a bribe and left a flank exposed, causing an entire company to be swallowed by a drift while allies could only hear muffled cries and watch as their comrades disappeared. Other betrayals were quieter, officials who siphoned oil meant for hospitals, diverting it to their own houses and condemning the sick to a slow freeze. Such acts haunted the peace that followed the war, seeding distrust for generations. Small units specialized in acts of sabotage that were particularly cruel in the cold. Teams would smear a bridge with oil to make horses slide and break their legs, or they would drill holes in food stores so that rats, emboldened by an easy opening, consumed supplies that might have lasted a month. Sabotage sometimes backfired. A team sent to burn an enemy depot would see the flames meet the night air and create a glassy glare that alerted the defenders. These misfires became warnings about the unpredictability of warfare within an unforgiving climate. One of the war's most dramatic phases involved a campaign through the polar valley of Kherhold, a corridor that linked two seas and was studded with frozen lakes that reflected the heavens. Whoever controlled the valley could funnel trade and starlighting lenses, and the southern empires saw it as a prize that could cripple Hyperborean cohesion. The Hyperboreans, however, rigged the valley with hidden sluices that could flood and freeze paths overnight, turning columns into mazes and breaking the rhythm of marches. The fighting in Caerhold was marked by improvisation and a kind of savage humor. Soldiers carved messages into blocks of snow as warnings, and when a southern battalion found their path turned into a mirror of light by Hyperborean reflectors, they became convinced they'd stumbled into an army of specters. Night raids involved bodies moving silently across black ice, and skirmishes turned on tiny mistakes, a dropped knife, a breath puffing white in the wrong direction. Victory there required a balance of courage and calm mathematics of movement. As winter held firm, entire populations migrated or were conscripted into war industries. Villages that had been fishing hamlets morphed into foundries for ship parts, and teachers took to training conscripts in map reading and ice navigation. Children were taught to read drifts as if they were books, to notice the way fat-tailed seals left a depression that warned of thin ice. War turned whole societies inward, reassigning labor and remolding social structures into tighter knots. Casualties mounted, but so did the war's intimate effects on identity. Songs changed to include the names of fallen leaders, weavers incorporated patterns that represented famous bridges or lost cities. Names that once denoted geographical features became honorifics in newly minted regiments, regiments that would later be memorialized in vitrified public monuments by the victorious powers. In this way, loss itself became a kind of architecture, built into the lexicon of remembrance. Not all conflicts were large-scale. The Frozen War was also a mosaic of domestic struggles, brothers who argued about whether to flee a town and leave behind ancestral graves, elders who argued that resources must be preserved for the future and not squandered in a single campaign. These arguments shaped decisions that determined life or death for whole lines of family. The war thus tested not only armies but the moral calculus of communities. Medical practice adapted quickly, with surgeons developing protocols to treat frostbite that involved gradual rewarming instead of sudden immersion, and ointments made from rendered blubber and certain lichens that reduced infection. Hospitals were converted into wards with layered birch walls and steam rooms that allowed surgeons to operate without turning instruments brittle. The language of medicine itself grew darker, with new terms for sounds and symptoms peculiar to prolonged cold exposure. The vocabulary became a tool for both healing and horror. The mental toll of the war manifested in strange behaviors that became common enough to be noticed by chroniclers. Some soldiers developed a sensitivity to light that left them agitated by dawn, while others spoke of hearing the ice whispering in a language only they could understand. Survivors told stories of a numbness that cleared the edges of time, leaving days to drift into each other like overlapping hours. These psychic marks proved as persistent as any physical scar. Despite the suffering, or perhaps because of it, a generation of artists emerged whose work spoke of endurance. Painters used pigments derived from crushed lapis and whale fat to create images that shimmered when the viewer moved. Songwriters collected short refrains that could be hummed while working to maintain cadence and sanity during long winter repairs. These creative forms became a communal therapy, keeping despair at bay and providing a vocabulary for trauma. The final years of the Frozen War were not dominated by a single battle but by attrition and negotiation. Economies that could no longer sustain constant campaigns forced councils to the table, and a series of localized treaties began to stitch the map back together. The Meridian, battered but wise, brokered agreements that redistributed key passages and established demilitarized ice lanes that would be policed by mixed teams. The peace was uneasy and negotiated in installments, like a debt repaid in small coins. The aftermath saw a tumultuous reshuffling of populations. Some cities emptied permanently as survivors migrated to centers that promised more stable climates or better trade. Others were repopulated by refugees who stitched new neighborhoods into old foundations. The physical scars of battle were visible for centuries, a scar in the glacier where a mine had detonated, an island now ringed with glassy shards from an old bombardment, and terraces where crops once grew replaced by wind-scoured stone. Memory became a battleground in its own right. Each polity told its own version of events, emphasizing heroism and minimizing the atrocities. Monuments rose quickly, both to commemorate and to shape narratives, statues of stern leaders whose faces were softened by artists to look more noble, plaques that claimed moral victory for the suffering of the people. Conversely, some communities refused monuments, choosing instead to let certain places remain unmarked as a deliberate refusal to glorify war. Trade resumed at a trembling pace, and in time the economies that had adapted to survive the stress of winter war integrated techniques learned from both sides. Southern merchants imported Hyperborean snow shields and lens technologies, while the Hyperboreans adopted certain southern agricultural practices suitable for sun harvests. Cultural exchange, once a victim of conflict, re-emerged as its unexpected beneficiary. The war also catalyzed governance reforms. The Meridian reorganized its councils to include representatives from previously marginalized enclaves, and a new code of winter law was drafted to standardize what had once been local and varied practices. These reforms were not uniformly effective, but they helped stabilize trade and reduce the likelihood of localized violence erupting into full-scale war. They served as a reminder that institutions can be rebuilt even after they have been tested to failure. Historians in later ages would study the Frozen War and draw parallels to other conflicts, seeing in it a template for how climate can shape politics and how societies adapt to stress. Archaeologists would later uncover entire districts swallowed by crevasses, preserving artifacts in a kind of cold time that rendered cloth and wood nearly intact. These discoveries refined the story, revealing daily life amid siege and small kindnesses that textbooks had overlooked. Archaeological finds included personal items that humanized the war, a carved whistle used by a child to summon a father from the frost, a needle case made from bone with initials etched inside, and a journal wrapped in oilcloth listing ration numbers beside prayers and recipes. These objects allowed later generations to reconstruct lives torn between endurance and hope, supplying context that maps and treaties could never provide. The war also left ecological legacies that would be discussed for centuries. Certain migration routes of whales shifted after years of naval activity, and the carving of ice channels altered local currents, affecting plankton blooms that supported entire food chains. Some regions took decades to recover their pre-war productivity, while others adapted to new patterns of marine life, setting in motion slow ecological changes that shaped the subsistence of coastal communities. Cultural memory persisted in ways that outlived politics. Festivals were instituted to mark the end of hostilities, rituals of reconciliation that involved sharing repurposed metal and soup cooked by combined communities. People lit bonfires, meager but symbolic, on nights where the aurora was brightest, and towns would ring bells at midday in silent remembrance. Over generations, the significance of these rites changed, but they always carried the trace of trauma and the intention of repair. Some myths hardened into cautionary tales, stories of a general who tried to conquer the heavens and broke the weather, of a city that vanished into a crack because its leaders forgot to listen to the elders. These tales functioned as moral instruction, warning future leaders about the hubris of trying to master forces beyond human comprehension. They became part of school curriculums and bedtime stories alike, shaping a cultural prudence about expansion. Poetry, perhaps more than any other form, captured the paradox of the Frozen War, the way it both annihilated and refined. Poets wrote about the economy of silence that war imposed, about how sound itself became a rare and precious commodity. Verses spoke of lamps that flickered like small suns rescued from extinguishment, and of hands that met in darkness and belonged to people who recognized each other by scent alone. These lines circulated in collections passed from hand to hand, sustaining identity in a period when everything else seemed ephemeral. Cross-border marriages, once tactical, became sincere unions after the war, binding communities and creating kin networks that blurred the lines of former enmities. Children born of such unions often became cultural translators, growing up with the vocabulary and rituals of both sides and helping to forge hybrid practices that eased trade and increased tolerance. Over time, these familial ties helped weave a new regional stability that neither sword nor treaty could have achieved alone. Technological legacies included permanent changes in construction and agriculture. Architects learned to embed ventilation channels that preserved heat and reduced condensation in cold buildings, and agronomists developed strains of root crops that could be stored for longer without spoilage. These advances had practical benefits and symbolic weight, demonstrating that war's harsh lessons could lead to incremental improvements in human welfare. Museums eventually curated exhibitions of the Frozen Era, balancing the need to educate with sensitivity to trauma. Curators arranged artifacts not as trophies but as testaments, creating spaces where visitors could walk among reconstructed streets that suggested the everyday lives of men and women in winter. Audio guides narrated in calm voices, describing the hush of snowfall and the shock of bombardment, allowing listeners to imagine scenes without sensationalizing them. Scholars debated endlessly about the ethical choices made during the war. Was it legitimate to divert resources for the sake of winning a critical pass, even if it meant civilian suffering? Did the sanctity of certain sites justify strategic restraint? These questions had no neat answers and followed the war into courtrooms, into academic journals, and into the private reflections of those who had ordered attacks. The discussions were as much about the future as about the past. Survivor networks formed an essential part of the post-war landscape. Associations of widows, veterans, and displaced persons lobbied for pensions and memorials, and they organized mutual aid to rebuild towns and hospitals. Their archives, often kept in the margins of official records, provided candid testimony about the grim calculations made during the conflict and the small acts of compassion that preserved life. The Frozen War also produced a literature of contrition. Playwrights staged dramas where rulers were forced to reckon with choices that led to suffering, and audiences responded with tears and outrage that occasionally spilled into policy reform. These creative responses were not merely cathartic, they influenced public discourse and shaped the moral boundaries of future conduct. Climate itself remained an unpredictable actor. There were years when unusually mild seasons allowed for bountiful harvests and eased tensions, while sudden drops in temperature could reignite disputes over newly exposed resources. These swings underlined a central lesson of the Frozen War: human plans matter, but they always coexist with natural forces that can reroute even the most carefully laid designs. Decades after the treaties were signed, a new generation came of age that had not seen the worst years of conflict. For them, the stories of the Frozen War were both heritage and warning. They were taught to respect the ice, to understand the fragility of supply chains, and to practice forms of governance meant to prevent the escalation that had once enveloped the world. The memory of war had become a civic curriculum. International law took cues from the conflict, with treaties later codifying protections for civilian infrastructure during winter campaigns and establishing clear processes for dispute resolution over icy waterways. These laws were imperfect and did not stop all conflicts, but they reflected the hard-earned consensus that certain behaviors escalated risks unnecessarily. In a sense, legislation became another instrument for baking in prudence. The remnants of Hyperborean technology became symbols of an era of adaptation. Sled designs influenced later polar exploration, and lens-making techniques informed navigational tools that improved safety for sailors. Even culinary practices crossed borders, with preservation methods that made long winter voyages more survivable being adopted in distant ports. The diffusion of such innovations showed how wartime necessity could seed peacetime benefits. Memorialization took many forms: silent marches along old highways, plaques installed on ships that had once sailed into battle, and small shrines in towns where a single street had once been obliterated. Some regions created living memorials, replanting windbreaks that had been felled during campaigns. These acts combined grief with reconstruction, suggesting that remembrance could be productive and not merely elegiac. The Frozen War also reshaped philosophical thought. Thinkers wrote about the ethics of survival and argued about whether survival justified certain sacrifices. Schools of thought emerged that treated climate as a primary factor in moral reasoning, suggesting that obligations to the environment were integral to obligations to fellow humans. These ideas diffused into public policy and into the cultural vocabulary of responsibility. Over generations, the stark lines of alliance blurred, and new cultural forms emerged that mixed Hyperborean austerity with southern warmth. Festivals combined candles and auroral dances, and cuisine fused preserved root stews with salted fish into new staples. This hybrid culture came to be regarded by many as a richer inheritance than either pure lineage. The ruins of battlefields became places of pilgrimage for some, not to glorify the past, but to honor the resilience it represented. Visitors walked slowly across plains where cannons had once been dragged, and they touched stones smoothed by centuries of wind. For them, the landscape itself was a teacher, an archive where nature and history conspired to keep lessons alive. At the heart of many stories from the Frozen War was a recurring image, a single candle burning in a window, visible across a frozen strait on a clear night. That light signified more than hope. It signified a commitment to continuity, a promise that people would reclaim warmth and that memory would be preserved. It was the sort of quiet emblem that could be understood across languages and ages. In literature and art, the war became a foil for exploring human choices. Novels were written in which a small band of characters opted for mercy under pressure, their decision rippling outward into political change. Such narratives emphasized the agency of ordinary people and argued that individual acts of compassion could redirect the momentum of grand strategies. The stories circulated widely and had an impact on how leaders were judged in subsequent conflicts. Commemorative architecture took a restrained form in many cities, avoiding monumental triumphalism in favor of functional memorials, hospitals, schools, and seawalls that doubled as markers. These structures served living needs while acknowledging past sacrifices. They embodied an ethic that memory should also heal. The Frozen War left personal legacies too, family names that carried honor, scars that were worn with quiet dignity, recipes that were only shared at certain festivals. These idiosyncratic inheritances threaded through generations and linked the present to the past in ways official histories could not capture. They were the connective tissue of cultural memory. As the world warmed in later eras, new interpretations of the war emerged. Some scholars argued that the conflict had been a tragic misallocation of resources triggered by environmental stress, while others insisted it had catalyzed innovation and solidarity. The debate was less about assigning blame than about understanding how societies respond to existential threats, lessons about resilience, and about the dangers of zero-sum thinking. The Frozen War continued to be studied not only for its military lessons but for its moral and ecological implications. Planners considered it when designing resilient infrastructure, and ethicists used its dilemmas as case studies. Schoolchildren learned of it alongside tales of local heroism, and the narrative informed public conversations about the limits of growth and the necessity of cooperation. Generational memory shifted the war into myth and principle, into stories told at long tables and in the hush between seasons. The younger generation, distant from the actual fighting, regarded the past with a mixture of reverence and impatience, wanting to learn from it but wary of letting it dictate their futures. They asked new questions about how to honor sacrifice without being trapped by old grievances. The Frozen War left an enduring impression on the arts of lament and hope. Painters captured the icy hush of battlefield mornings, while musicians composed slow laments that became national songs. These works served as cultural anchors, reminding people of the cost of conflict and of the fragile beauty of a world where warmth is precious. In the end, the Frozen War was not a single ironclad episode but an extended process that reshaped how societies understood one another and the environment. It taught that climate could be a determinant of policy and that adaptation was as important as conquest. Its lessons remained urgent: avoid hubris, honor the land, and remember that survival often requires humility and mutual aid. Those who walked the old frozen fields long after the last cannon stopped had a certain quiet about them, a reserve born of witnessing extremes. They told stories of waiting and of small mercies, of nights when a shared bowl of stew could mean the difference between continuing and surrendering. Their memory was the most durable artifact of the war, a living testimony that human communities could endure and remake themselves even after the fiercest storms. This is the story of how empires clashed in a world governed by ice, of how tactics and compassion intertwined, and of how the aftermath became a mosaic of memory, law, and renewal. It is a reminder that when the weather itself becomes an actor in human affairs, choices that once seemed peripheral become decisive. In the long sweep of history, the Frozen War stands as both caution and testament, an austere chapter where humanity learned that survival and dignity are often forged together in the cold. Listen to the hush that lives before words, the long inhalation that the Arctic seems to hold between one aurora and the next. Imagine a world of light and ice so precise that city walls glinted like the inside of a watch, where the horizon was a sharp blade of color and every step on the snow sounded as if the world were exhaling. This is the opening scene of a civilization that learned to read the sky like a book, to fold sound and crystal into living things, and to shape time itself into rituals that kept them afloat on a sea of white. The name they would later be given by strangers, the Hyperboreans, carries with it a suggestion of the remote and the mythic, but for them it was neither myth nor distance, it was home and industry, a place where technology and faith braided together until they were indistinguishable. They built their cities in the clefts where the ice met stone, and sheltered bays where the wind braided the snow into natural acoustics that moved voices like threads of light. Towers rose like translucent lungs, hollowed columns that captured the aurora and funneled its energies through veins of crystal and metal. In the evenings, their lamps were not flame but a controlled shimmer, a lattice of bioluminescent flora coaxed to glow by faint electric whispers, and entire neighborhoods would pulse in response to the heartbeat of the sky. Walking through one of their thoroughfares felt less like moving through a city and more like moving through a living score of light, where every path had a note and every crossing a chord to be considered. Language among them had tempo and pitch, and the Hyperborean tongue was full of words that could only be spoken at dawn when the air thinned and the stars exhaled frost. They named things not by shape but by function, and even their curses and blessings were verbs that called world weather into cooperation. Their scholars were as much priests as engineers, and the places we would call observatories were temples of calculation where poets and mathematicians heat-minted equations until they fit the curvature of the sky. That intermingling made their knowledge holistic. To heal was to recalibrate a rhythm, to build was to compose, every invention both useful and liturgical. They had a relationship with cold that read like a treaty. Cold was not simply an enemy to beat back with fire, it was a material with textures and moods, the way an artisan treats stone. They carved and annealed ice into transparent conduits, embedded with wire-thin filaments that directed light with more precision than any glass could manage. Those conduits carried warm air and cooled currents in equal measure, allowing homes to hold comfortable climates while remaining part of the landscape instead of divorced from it. Their architects argued that the city's aesthetics should never resist the greater climate. They sought to harmonize with wind patterns and solar tilt so that buildings flexed and channeled instead of resisting. Children learned the geometry of the sky from the earliest age, taught to trace auroral ribbons with their fingers, to map solstice arcs onto the backs of sleds and even into the braids of their hair. Education began with song and movement, then slowly folded into math and measurement, so that an apprentice could sing a function and feel its output in a set of precise motions. Apprenticeships were long, sometimes spanning decades, because they understood that mastery required time spent not only in the mind but in the skin. Crafts such as ice-smithing, star-threading, and deep memorial songcraft were revered, and elders who had spent a life training voices to carry through cave mouths were given positions of great authority. Everyday life tasted like mineral and broth and had the faint tang of sea salt that crept in through cracks in harbor walls. Their diet mixed foraged algae, protein from cold-adapted fish and sea mammals, and engineered strains of root vegetables that grew in thermal caves. They had domesticated a broad range of animals attuned to the night, not only for labor but for companionship and ritual, thick-furred sled beasts that could read the rhythm of auroras, and smaller creatures that burrowed in the insulation of homes and helpfully rearranged warmth. It might seem foreign to us, but the way they ate, slowly, as a series of shared gestures and exchanges, kept community bonds tight and turned every meal into a small governance of resources. Art for them was not a decoration but a conversation with the environment. Sculptors grew ice as if coaxing a tree to unfurl leaves. They used the slow work of crystal growth to embed images with the seasons already stitched into the material. Painters worked with suspended microcrystals and perfumed pigments that released scent when warmed, so that murals changed color and perfume as the day warmed toward noon. Musicians composed pieces designed to be played during different phases of the aurora, writing scores that synchronized light with sound so listening became seeing and seeing became feeling. Their festivals were therefore living exhibits, entire nights when the city rearranged itself to become a single, communal work of art. Trade across the broad Arctic was both practical and philosophical, because the Hyperboreans were keenly aware that their world was a complex feedback loop of ecosystems. They traded insulating materials and auroscopes to distant settlements in exchange for southern pigments and rare metals mined from fissures where geothermal warmth touched the ice. The caravans that left their ports were slow, ritualized journeys with set stops and songs for each leg, and the rhythm of trade lines came to define the calendar. Merchants were as much diplomats as captains of commerce, trained to read the social weather and ease tensions as they exchanged goods and stories. Their political structure was famously diffused. There was no single monarch wearing a fur crown, but a council of guilds and tuners, each holding ecological responsibility. The tuners adjusted the city's energy lattice, the guild of keepers maintained genetic stocks and seeds, the sound masters guided rituals of public decision. This diffusion minimized the risk of catastrophic decisions, for the Hyperboreans believed that legitimization required acknowledgement by multiple forms of knowledge at once, scientific, musical, and historical. Debate was procedural art, a public performance in which arguments were displayed as visible patterns in the air, so persuasion worked both in content and in design. Religion and science braided so tightly that one could not be criticized without the other recoiling. Their cosmology placed humans within a chain of listening. The planet's crust had a memory, the wind carried ancestral voices, and the aurora was the planet's sigh. Their priests taught that to harm the ice was to hurt the song of the land and that the best inventions were the ones that learned to listen. This ethic structured law, crimes against the natural rhythms, wasteful heating, reckless mining of crystal veins, were judged not only by harm to people but by the quality of noise they introduced into the environment. Buildings had names like instruments, Entire districts were called clarions and reverbs, and the marketplaces rang with a deliberate cacophony deliberately designed to be pleasing rather than ugly. The city's acoustic planners engineered echo and silence with equal care, carving canyons to carry stories longer and planting moss gardens to swallow unwanted noise. Public debates occurred in amphitheaters that refracted voice into harmonic clusters, forcing speakers to consider the oral consequences of their words. Even private quarrels were mediated by sound counselors who taught couples how to sing apologies that restored the city's balance. They were, by any measure, an advanced civilization in the way they understood systems. Networks of trade were modeled like circulatory systems, and goods were tracked with mnemonic devices tied to song and stone rather than numbers on a ledger. They used resonant beads, tuned to specific frequencies, as information keys. When passed through a public canal, their tones would release different vibrations in certain crystals, and that signal carried meaning across distances without physical transport. These auditory keys allowed them to orchestrate complex logistics across icebound plains, but the system's elegance was matched by fragility. A sudden shift in climate or an unexpected disruption in tone could misroute an entire fleet. They studied biology through an aesthetic lens. Gardens were not mere food sources but laboratories where plant breeders and poets worked side by side, cross-pollinating for flavor, for resilience, and for metaphor. They grew fungus that glowed faint green to mark dangerous paths and tubers that exuded a syrupy nectar used both in medicine and ceremony. Their healers specialized in cold medicine, but they also trained in narrative therapy. The act of telling and reshaping a patient's story was as critical as administering any tonic. Disease was treated as a misalignment of rhythm rather than only a pathology of cells, and treatments focused on re-establishing systemic harmony. Their celestial calendars were exquisite machines, etched in ice and metal on mountaintop observatories. They measured time by the opening and folding of auroral bands rather than by the orbit of a single planet, and those bands marked not only harvests but also the cycles of memory and mourning. Monuments to lost seasons tracked the slow encroachment of ice and the retreat of seas, and astronomers kept logs in the form of woven tapestries that changed color with humidity so that knowledge itself became a seasonal object. This relationship with time made them patient planners. Projects spanned generations, and there was a cultural comfort with investments whose returns would be seen by grandchildren. The mythic origin stories of their people involved listening stones, ancient monoliths that were said to hum with the memory of an older climate. Elders told how the first settlements had learned to interpret their hums, translating thrum into maps for the sowing of seed and for the anchoring of ships. In truth, these stones were geological anomalies that resonated at very low frequencies, but the Hyperboreans turned the stones into pedagogical tools, teaching children to tell subtle differences in pitch the way other cultures teach letters of the alphabet. Over time, those stones became sacred textbooks, and the act of studying them was both science and liturgy. They were not isolated from the rest of the world. Even as they excelled in cold technologies, they maintained routes of exchange with tempered cultures, trading innovations and myths alike. Offshore islands that warmed seasonally were places where southern sailors came to trade fish and stories of distant suns, and the Hyperborean polity learned about distant pests and plagues through these interactions. That contact sometimes brought trouble, a pest species hitchhiking on a cargo manifest, a rumor that inflamed tensions, or a disease that the locals had never had to treat. Yet contact also brought joy, new art forms to incorporate into their festivals, and a steady stream of ideas that kept them adaptable. However, their adaptability had limits because their metaphysics assumed a slow, interpretable world. The aurora was a teacher but also a friend. When it changed pattern, the first response was denial. To hear the sky change its song was like hearing a parent speak in a foreign tongue, interpreted as temporary, as an accident, as a phase to be remediated with ritual. Scientists offered models and warnings, but the cultural response favored ceremony. They chose to listen harder first, to enter long public councils and perform calisthenics of grief, hoping to persuade the stars to speak as they had always spoken. The earliest signs of stress were subtle and easy to miss. Sea ice that had always broken into neat flows began to fracture in scarred, chaotic ways. Currents shifted marginally and then more emphatically. The auroral bands that used to be reliable as clock hands grew restless, sliding and flickering where they once flowed like silk. Food stocks were taxed by these small deviations. Migratory fish arrived earlier or later and then in different numbers. The first decade of trouble looked like a stranger within the house that everyone would put up with, strange, inconvenient, but explainable. Their first projects to respond were brilliant in the old spirit. They constructed latticed mirrors and field arrays that tried to draw auroral energy into stable patterns, engineered feedback loops in the ice that dampened violent cracking, and rerouted nutrient flows in ocean channels to coax fish into historical routes. Many of these interventions worked in the short term, preserving fisheries around certain harbors and stabilizing public heating. The aesthetics of repair were especially important. Each fix had to be beautiful to preserve the city's sense of wonder. They made infrastructure into poetry, but poetry could not save a system once it had crossed certain thresholds. Every system has tipping points, and theirs was no different. As the climate shifted not only in pace but in nature, a cascade of failures followed. Engineered strains of algae that depended on cold currents began to fail, affecting not only food supplies but the way light filtered across the shallow bays, light that their acoustic keys needed to function. Permafrost thawed in sudden, jarring pulses, swallowing storage caverns and releasing methane in hisses that the city had never been designed to process. Crystalline conduits that carried light and sound became brittle in ways engineers had not predicted, shuddering under stresses and failing with catastrophic, sometimes explosive, suddenness. Then came the winter whose memory burned bright among survivors, a season of false dawns when the sky shimmered with unfamiliar colors and storms arrived in heavy, thunderous flurries that carried warm rain instead of snow. The warm rain was anathema. It froze over delicate structures into shell-like crusts and knocked down arrays that had only been built for brittle cold. The city's once perfect acoustic geometry turned wrong, echoes doubled where they once harmonized, and songs lost their resolution. Songs that had been used to coordinate fleets no longer carried the same directives, and a message sung perfectly might be misread by machines tuned to an obsolete pattern. Logistics began to unravel in plain human ways. Supply lines that had adapted for centuries were strained, trade caravans found new obstacles in degraded ice roads, and the social compact that sustained public works frayed. Where the council had once deliberated, factions emerged. Some advocated for massive geoengineering to force the environment back to its previous state. Others argued for migration, moving entire communities along mapped corridors to more temperate enclaves. These choices were not abstract, they were existential. Choosing wrongly could mean the literal extinguishing of whole neighborhoods in a single thaw. Human emotion intensified the crisis. Grief did practical work, not just emotional labor. Mourning rituals took stations near failing cryospheres, where elders intoned long, low songs designed to slow the ice's retreat. People burned incense of crushed kelp to mark losses of harvests and left offerings on broken conduits, hoping to coax back whatever was being lost. Others took more desperate steps. Raiders formed to seize remaining stockpiles, and old rivalries flared up over access to warm springs. The civil code, which had relied on consensus, found itself tested beyond anything its framers had imagined. We should also speak of the role of disease, which moved less like a hurricane and more like a leak. New pathogens found life in warmer water and in animals that had not previously been vectors, and behaviors needed to adapt faster than their social systems allowed. Healers tried new mixtures. They recomposed their narrative therapies into emergency measures and quarantined whole neighborhoods in acoustic chambers designed to muffle contagion. Some treatments worked, some did not, and the loss of skilled healers to illness proved especially crippling because their knowledge was so embodied and transmitted across long apprenticeships. Technology, once their greatest boon, started to betray them in small but lethal ways. Systems designed for crystalline conduction failed when crystals grew differently under altered humidity. Machines that could sense auroral frequencies miscalibrated when background noise rose from thawed springs and new storms. There were moments of tragic irony. A device meant to stabilize an area's microclimate overheated because warmer currents shifted a predicted thermal boundary. The very tools that had once allowed them to live in harmony with the cold now required adaptations that demanded time they did not have. In those months, a talent for improvisation emerged alongside panic. Some inventors, the sort who had been marginalized in calmer times for pursuing marginal arts, now became crucial. They repurposed fishing nets as thermal membranes, retrained acoustic keys into emergency communicators, and taught communities to use song as a way to manage stress and coordinate defenses. Those improvisations saved lives and reinforced a grim lesson: flexibility mattered more than purity of technique. New cultural forms arose and the pressure, short, sharp refrains of survival music replaced long meditative scores, and songs now included functional directives as well as beauty. Yet even as they adapted, bigger forces conspired. A series of submarine eruptions in a nearby rift released plumes of warm water and ash, further destabilizing currents. The eruptions also released strange minerals that corroded the crystal latticework they had relied on for centuries, and the chemical changes altered the color and frequency of auroral displays. It felt to many like betrayal by the planet itself, though geologically it was simply the interplay of mantle and ice. The effect for society, however, was the same: instruments grew unreliable, and the social imagination was pushed to the edge of its coping mechanisms. The councils convened emergency councils, and the debates grew louder on the public amphitheaters. Some proposed relocation to the southern island chains that had long traded with the Hyperboreans, arguing that survival required abandoning old aesthetics for functionality. More conservative factions countered that to leave would be to abandon identity, that to live is to live within the song of the Arctic. There were no easy compromises. Every option required sacrifice, and sacrifice was unevenly distributed. Some families would go, some would stay, and those choices would rip communities into new patterns. As migration began, it filled the ceremonial lanes with a strange traffic. Sleds once decorated for celebration were now laden with essentials and relics. Elders insisted on taking stones that hummed and the woven tapestries of memory. The journeys were perilous, for the ice channels were less stable and storms came with new ferocity. Caravans learned to move with the seasons, to avoid unfrozen seas and to time crossings with transient windows of cold. Along the way, they had to negotiate passage through rival claims and were sometimes turned away by those who feared contagion or competition for scarce resources. Those who stayed behind tried other means. There were bold geoengineering projects that attempted to capture and redirect auroral energy into vast condenser fields, a technological mimicry of the old rhythms. These projects had partial successes, pockets of stability where small neighborhoods persisted for years beyond expectations, but such projects were resource-intensive and vulnerable to sabotage. Every time a condenser field failed, it did not simply darken a lamp. It silenced a social memory, erased a local tradition that had used that field as a hummingbird for songs and rites. Over time, the cognitive landscape shifted along with the physical one. The younger generation grew up amid portability and contingency, less attached to the long apprenticeship model and more skilled at modular improvisation. They were excellent at jury-rigging, at turning what remained into functional forms quickly. That skill was useful but had cultural costs. The long meditative arts, the patient, season-spanning compositions, began to evaporate. Some elders mourned the loss like a death, for they had watched not only their city's infrastructure decline but a way of thinking itself. The narrative of the fall included acts of bravery and cruelty, and both deserve notice. Rescue missions into storm belts saved children and elders trapped in fissures, and the risk-taking of these teams created legends. On the other hand, predatory bands plundered nutrient storages and vandalized sacred stones, further eroding trust. Those acts hardened communities into smaller, more insular groups, with trust increasingly scarce where it had once been abundant. Archaeological traces from the later period show an interesting paradox: increased craft damage but also astonishing creativity. People adapted artifacts into new forms, lamps became musical instruments, sled runners became the frames for emergency shelters, and fragments of sacred glass were repurposed into signal mirrors. The aesthetics of scarcity developed a beauty of its own, a kind of elegant austerity that sang of necessity rather than leisure. Later scholars who discovered such objects marveled at the resourcefulness, but these improvisations also pointed to a deeper sorrow. The thing-making had become pure survival instead of ritual. Climate's relentless advance meant more than material loss. It changed the way stories were told. Where once narratives centered on listening to the land and deciphering rhythms, now tales focused on crossings, on ways to outlast storms and navigate treacherous channels. Songlines were shortened into functional chants that helped keep sled teams together through whiteouts, and mating songs adapted to new sounds that predators made in thawed streams. Nouns lost some of their reverence, verbs regained urgency. The cultural memory of falls always includes certain formative events, and for the Hyperboreans, one such event became known as the Night of Throbbing Ice. It was a single night when methane pockets burst through thawed permafrost and erupted along the coast, igniting in arcs that lit the sky with unnatural flames for hours. People who lived through it later described the sound as a vast, mechanical heartbeat, a drumming against the city's foundations that seemed almost intentional. That night destroyed archives of woven memory stored in shallow vaults and took with it a library of observational tapestries, erasing decades of recorded sky patterns. Without those archives, their ability to interpret change diminished dramatically. Memory in that civilization was not only oral, it was materially encoded in tapestries, stones, and resonant beads. Loss of these objects meant the loss of calibration for centuries of knowledge. Healers who had long used ritual songs tied to particular storerooms found their songs now misplaced, less effective because their anchors were gone. The community tried to reconstruct the archives, but reconstruction is always partial, and gaps favor myth. Myth began to fill space left by lost knowledge, and myths are both dangerous and consoling. They offered narratives of betrayal by the planet and narratives of heroism and carried forward unity when the material world could not. The more myth filled the void, the more the young asked new questions. Myths cannot answer engineering decisions. Generational conflict intensified. Older leaders invoked the old myths to maintain order while younger planners demanded empirical reconstructions and cold-hearted risk assessment. Neither approach could stabilize the entire system. A second wave of migrations occurred when seas warmed enough for predictable shipping lanes to open for at least a part of the year. Small ships could pass between archipelagos, allowing communities to attempt seaborne relocation. Some groups moved inland toward highlands and began to learn agriculture traditions from warmer neighbors, an awkward mixing of northern and southern knowledge. Others went farther, across seas, carrying with them a fragmentary culture that would later be misremembered by faraway peoples as myth and legend. As the diaspora spread, its cultural effects were deep. Hyperborean motifs showed up in distant jewelry crafted on warmer islands, and certain lullabies transformed into sea shanties with a different beat. Craftsmen who crossed waters integrated exotic pigments into their palettes. The old city aesthetics reappeared in pockets, hybridized. Still, loss of context meant that none of these new communities could perfectly transplant the old practices. The old balance of listening and tuning was, in many ways, untranslatable to new climates and social structures. What remained in the original homeland changed slowly into a palimpsest of ruins and adaptation. Some enclaves managed to hold on for decades, buoyed by microclimates and sheer stubbornness. These enclaves became centers of memory, often stubborn, cantankerous places whose elders refused to move or change their names. They cultivated a culture of preservation, sealing off certain knowledge in vaults and passing down the role of keeper like an heirloom. The last of these keepers became the living repositories of old songs, and their deaths marked the end of many specific practices. Even in decline, the Hyperboreans produced art that later generations revered. There is a particular late-period glasswork known for its thinness and refractive intensity that seems to capture the last aurora in a single shard. Those shards sometimes served as fulcrums for memory. A single piece placed near a hearth could sit like a lens, focusing the room's light so that an elder's voice seemed to extend further into the night. The aesthetics of scarcity created a culture of treasures that were not lavish but intensely meaningful, objects whose presence stitched time together across gaps in living memory. Stories of the last light, the phrase later historians used to describe the final decades of the Hyperborean presence in the Arctic, often became melodramatic in retellings. But the truth was a more complicated mix of quiet endurance and abrupt catastrophe. There were both protracted declines and sudden endings, and survivors often found themselves forced into compromise, trading away old songs for practical engineering knowledge to survive. Over generations, the original cultural forms either adapted into new practices or were allowed to dissolve into the hybrid arts of diaspora. We must not forget those who adapted by reinventing their myths into new cosmologies, integrating elements of southern faiths they encountered during migration and thereby creating syncretic traditions that still remembered the aurora. In some seaside cities, they retained the practice of weaving time into tapestries, but the imagery now included palms and mangroves alongside ice spires. Rituals adapted accordingly. Offerings once placed on frozen stones were now placed on driftwood or coral, but the core animist sense, that the world remembered and responded, remained. Such continuity is one of the most powerful legacies of the Hyperboreans. Technological knowledge was another legacy. Many innovations in insulation, cryopreservation, and sound-based signaling disseminated widely after the fall. Communities that accepted Hyperborean engineers or settled near them benefited from these techniques and incorporated them into otherwise unrelated architectures. Some of those techniques proved critical in later centuries for preserving seeds and medical matter. In this way, the fall of the Hyperboreans ceded technical progress elsewhere even as it consumed their own society. Their archival artifacts, scattered across trade routes and later excavated by archaeologists, became touchstones for scholars of a much later age. In the modern era, those who study material culture found in the Arctic remnants that suggested not a simple barbaric past but an intricate experimental civilization. Tapestries that had survived in cold caves provided patterns of auroral frequencies, and strands of ancient music recovered from cones of glass could be played again in experimental reconstructions. These reconstructions allowed modern listeners to feel something of the old music's timbre, though never its full meaning. The ethical questions surrounding archaeological practice in those sites remain contentious. Should one disturb sleeping artifacts to learn from them, or should one leave them as memorials, unprobed and quiet? Those debates echo the older internal convulsions of the Hyperboreans themselves, between preservation and adaptation, between the reverence for what has been and the need to respond to what is becoming. Modern explorers often find themselves repeating old dilemmas in new clothes, and the lesson seems universal: context matters as much as content when culture is being studied. Some of the most haunting artifacts are not objects but stories, oral fragments reconstructed from the songs of diaspora grandchildren. These fragments show how a culture can survive even as its material bases fail. They recorded not only heroic deeds but banal instructions: how to lash a sled, how to read the low hum of a hummed stone, preserving practical knowledge embedded within beauty. In those fragments we find a people who survived intellectually even while their city died physically, a reminder that culture is both fragile and deeply replicative. The ecological lessons of the Hyperborean collapse are direct and painful. They did not fail through a single sin of pride but through a complex interaction of environmental change, technological limitation, political indecision, and the inexorable chemistry of the planet. Attempts to fix the problem were often well-intentioned but incomplete because their designs presumed a stationary climate rather than a dynamic one. The story forces us to consider how we plan when environments can shift outside the parameters of historical experience. Yet any elegy must also describe acts of tenderness. The last recorded deeds of some groups involved people who chose to burn their most precious archives in careful ritual rather than let them be plundered, scattering ashes in the sea with words meant to teach future generations about respect. Others carefully sent small duplicates of their strongest songs with migrating groups, trusting that song could act as cultural seed. The fall was therefore not only loss, it also included deliberate efforts to propagate what they most valued in whatever form the next world might accept. People left behind diverse marks, stone-lined graves, small shrines attached to collapsing domains, and carved posts where vessels had once been moored. Explorers coming centuries later often discovered these monuments as if they were fingerprints left on cold glass. Each one told a slightly different story: of a family that refused to leave, of a captain who resettled community members to safety, of an engineer who sacrificed a job to deter a raiding band. The human stories are what make the ruins relatable. They turn abstract collapse into choices made in rooms full of breath. The Hyperborean diaspora, paradoxically, enriched the cultures they touched. Their knowledge persisted in pockets across archipelagos, inspiring local inventors and storytellers. Their music influences turned up in the most unlikely of places, and certain motifs, glass shards used as narrative lenses, resonant beads used for memory aids, appear in cultural artifacts far from the Arctic. Scholars now sometimes speak of a Hyperborean diaspora aesthetic, an emphasis on conservation, on hearing the environment, on making beauty functional. There were few clean endings. Even when a central city fell, groups survived in hidden places for generations, tucked into geothermal hollows and surviving off retooled agriculture. Some maintained a ritual continuity that allowed them to claim descent from the original city, others intentionally severed ties to adapt more radically. This diversity of survival strategies complicates any single narrative of decline and allows the story to be one of multiple local survivals rather than a single apocalyptic event. Survivors who integrated into Southern cultures sometimes exchanged hyper-specialized knowledge: how to manage permafrost gardens in marginal climates, how to engineer sound-based signaling across long distances, and methods of preserving seeds in shifting weather. Those methods became cornerstones of resilience for other societies, enabling peoples in different climates to better respond to their changing local conditions. In that sense, the Hyperborean legacy continued as a kind of distributed resilience, a set of techniques that could be adopted and adapted by others. The memory of the Hyperboreans also endured through literature and song as a cautionary tale about the limits of hubris and the necessity of humility in the face of planetary force. Poets wrote elegies that were less about blame and more about the fundamental vulnerability of any civilization that depends on a precarious balance. Those elegies survive in libraries and oral traditions alike, sometimes recited as winter prayers in communities far from the original sites. The story's pathos made it an archetype in subsequent cultural thought, the advanced people who listened, who tried to live artfully with the land, and who nonetheless could not forever stave off a grand reorientation. In modern times, climate scientists, philosophers, and artists often return to the Hyperborean case as a narrative that illuminates the moral complexity of adaptation and mitigation. It is tempting to frame their fall as a warning, a neat parable with a moral at the end, but the reality resists such simplicity. Their story is large and messy, full of brilliant improvisations and tragic rigidities, and that messiness is the very point. Entire societies are not simply machines to be optimized. They are collections of stories, practices, and institutions that either strengthen or weaken under stress. The best way to honor that complexity is to keep listening, as they once did, while also changing the habits of interpretation. Listening alone, however deep, is not enough if the environment changes faster than our rituals can reconcile it. Their civilization teaches that deep knowledge, reverence, and artful living can make communities ingenious and humane, but that those qualities must be paired with adaptive strategies that account for abrupt, nonlinear change. In other words, there is a moral about balance. Combine respect with empirical risk assessment, the poet's ear with the engineer's skepticism. Their fall also raises a question about what we preserve and why. The Hyperboreans preserved song, memory, and technical skill in ways that seem wildly different from modern archival practice, and yet their methods had deep ecological intelligence. Modern preservation should perhaps learn from that blend of embodied knowledge and community practice, acknowledging that knowledge lives not only in objects but in ritual, apprenticeship, and social forms. Preservation that ignores living practice risks creating museum relics rather than sustaining resilient cultures. There are haunted corners in the post-fall landscape where a single sculpture, half buried in thawed silt, still refracts light in strange ways, making a living eye of an otherwise dead shape. Those corners become pilgrimage sites for descendants and strangers alike who wish to stand where the old city stood and feel the last light. The experience is not simply nostalgia, it is a physical confrontation with contingency, a reminder that no matter how bright a civilization's instruments, light can wane. Those who sit in such quiet places often report a small, hollow feeling in the chest, a compassionate ache for what was lost and a renewed sense of responsibility to what remains. As scientists reconstruct the past through ice cores and sediment layers, they find nuances that complicate the narrative of unmitigated decline. Not all changes were catastrophic at once, and in some regions local microclimates buffered communities for surprisingly long intervals. These findings open a more complicated conversation about resilience and local adaptation, suggesting that some community strategies worked for a time and might still be applicable today if adapted to current conditions. The archaeological record supports this complexity, showing patterns of persistence and innovation alongside collapse. Ultimately, the story of the Hyperboreans ends not with a single final light but with a scattering of lights, some extinguished, some transplanted, and some singing in new keys. Their greatest legacy may not be the ruined towers or the scattered shards, but the underlying ethic of listening. Even in the cities that rose after them, faint echoes of their approach to the environment can be heard, a preference for tuning instead of domination, for art that serves and technology that harmonizes. Those echoes are fragile, but they are also a living inheritance to anyone willing to learn how to fold attention into action. We return, finally, to the image that began this story, a city that breathed along with the aurora, whose last light was not a simple candle blown out but a complex receding. A set of transformations in which people tried, with courage and creativity, to stay aligned with a new planet. Their fall is neither cautionary moral nor triumphalist tale but a mirror for us, to look long at how societies respond when the ground, both physical and social, moves beneath them. The Hyperboreans teach us about the dignity of thoroughgoing listening and the practical necessity of flexible, collective action when that listening reveals inconvenient truths. In their story we find some sorrowful advice and, if we are willing to hear it, a last glint of hope. Their story isn't just about the past, it's about us learning to survive together when everything changes. Subscribe and write in the comments what moves you more, their calm strength or the light they still left behind.